Welcome to the Preserving the Sanctity of Life at the End of Life virtual conference. I'm Rose Mimms, Executive Director of Arkansas Right to Life. Today, we are joined by over 150 friends from around Arkansas and from Alaska, California, Florida, Kansas, Oregon, and Canada. Thank you all for your interest in this important topic. I know that you will be informed and equipped to make decisions that will affect your own life and the lives of your loved ones. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank our co-sponsors of today's conference, the Diocese of Little Rock Respect Life Office, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and Family Council. And to all of our friends that help promote the event across our state, especially the Northwest Arkansas Respect Life Council and the Doc Washburn Show on KARN. We are excited to have 5 great speakers and presentations. Alex Schadenberg, Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in Ontario, Canada, will educate us on what is happening with assisted suicide in America. Dr. William Toffler, Family Medicine in Portland, Oregon, reveals the truth about the assisted suicide law in Oregon and the facts about the lethal drug experiments by the assisted suicide lobby. Dr. David Smith, a hospice and palliative medicine specialist at Baptist Health in Little Rock, explains what do we mean dying, euphemisms, and deceptions associated with the end of life. Father Jason Tyler, bioethicist for the Diocese of Little Rock and pastor of St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Fayetteville, will help us find Christian spirituality in the dying process. And Father Joseph Chan, MD, chaplain at Mercy Hospital, will share his near-death experience, a personal journey. We will be on time today. I know your time is important, and so we will be on time. Remember that all those attending today are muted. Only presenters will be speaking. If you have a question, if you haven't already submitted it, please type it in the chat feature, and we will do our best to answer it during the Q&A at the conclusion of today's conference. The only exception to the questions will be Dr. Toffler, and immediately following his talk, he will take a few questions since he won't be able to stay to the end. We also have included a short 10-minute break at 3:30 p.m. Thank you again for joining us. We're getting started right away.
My name's Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint for you, and I'm going to share it with you. So what we'll do is we're going to go from beginning, so you'll be able to see the PowerPoint fine. There we go. And I deal with issues around euthanasia and assisted suicide. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to first start by defining that for you. I will say from the beginning, though, that we're happy, as I say, to take a lot of questions. This conference in itself, as you notice, is highly focused on end-of-life issues. So let's really focus on that. Not to say that there aren't other important issues, but today, this is our focus, and this is what we're working on with you to help you become better aware, educated, etc. on these issues. So when we're talking about assisted suicide, so assisted suicide is defined by the American Medical Association as a physician-assisted suicide occurs when a physician facilitates a patient's death by providing the necessary means and or information to enable that patient to perform the life-ending act. So I'm saying this because we have to understand what assisted suicide is. The other side talks about this as being, aid in dying, as this being compassionate, end-of-life care. They use all these terms they use. What it is a doctor or someone else, usually a doctor, but now the assisted suicide lobby is trying to widen that. But currently it's doctors who are then providing lethal prescriptions knowing that this person is going to end their life with this. And so we're going to go into this issue with you as to what they actually do. And but the fact of it is this is about somebody who's knowingly involved with causing the death of another person. This is not about an accidental death. This is not about a prescription that was not meant to cause death, but someone took the whole prescription rather than taking one pill a day. This is about an intentional situation to cause that person's death, okay? When people say to me, oh, Alex, it's my body, it's my choice, is it not okay that we can cause our own death? I would say, well, wait a second here. As much as I'm not in any way supporting the concept of suicide, physician-assisted suicide is when someone's directly involved in the act, right? They're directly involved. They are the person who's actually approving the act, and we'll get into all that in a second. They're facilitating an act that causes death. The American Medical Association is opposed to assisted suicide, and they write it, it's understandable, though tragic, that some patients in extreme duress, such as those suffering from a terminal, painful, debilitating illness, may come to decide that death is preferable to life. However, allowing physicians to participate in assisted suicide would cause more harm than good. Physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as healer. It would be difficult, or if not impossible, to control and would pose serious societal risks. And this is what we're actually then seeing when we legalize assisted suicide. This is actually sold then to the concept of choice and autonomy and personal, it's my choice, it's my decision. And what you're going to actually see in the law is how it's done. And that's what I'm going to explain to you in a second. Now, euthanasia and assisted suicide are different but the same. So I explain that euthanasia and assisted suicide, they're like two birds of a feather. They're the same thing but different. Euthanasia is the administration of a lethal agent. So therefore, the physician or somebody else is directly involved actually with causing the death. So what makes euthanasia and assisted suicide different is that in the case of assisted suicide, the physician is approving the act. They are prescribing the lethal drugs, so they are approving it. They're saying, yes, you qualify. I think your death is better than your continued life, or I agree with you. I would rather be dead than living in this situation. And they prescribe them the lethal drugs, and the person technically takes it themselves. In euthanasia, it's when the physician would then actually inject them. They actually take those same drugs or very similar, almost identical drugs, and they inject them. So in all other jurisdictions, euthanasia would be homicide. So if a doctor were to lethally inject you intentionally in Arkansas, that would be considered a homicide if it were intentionally done and with a dose that was intentionally to cause your death, okay? So euthanasia and assisted suicide are different in who does the act, right? In the case of euthanasia, somebody else is injecting you, whereas in the case of assisted suicide, they're directly involved, but you have to technically take the drugs yourself. Okay, so I think that's sort of clear. You're going to get more information about this from the presentations, especially from Dr. David Smith, but I think that that's the basic distinction between the two. Now, assisted suicide is currently legal in the US in California, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, Vermont, Washington State, and the District of Columbia, and it's permitted in Montana based on the Baxter Court decision. This is a really problematic situation that in the last few years, the assisted suicide lobby has successfully expanded the assisted suicide laws into more states. Okay, so what we have is a situation where assisted suicide was first legalized in Oregon. So you're going to be hearing later from Dr. Toffler. He will be speaking after me. And Dr. Toffler is a physician in Oregon who's involved with a group called Physicians for Compassionate Care. And they've been involved in opposing the assisted suicide law in Oregon from the beginning. It was originally legalized in Oregon in '94, but it didn't come into place because they were able to hold it up. It didn't come into legal ability to do it until the beginning of 1998. And you'll notice that if you look at what happened in the US, Oregon was the first state, and the assisted suicide lobby failed again and again and again and again to get it passed in the second state, and until 2008, where it was then legalized in Washington State. So Washington State legalized in 2008. It came into place in 2009. And even then, there was many years before they had a third state. In the last few years, they've actually sadly been legalizing in other places. Assisted suicide bills are currently being debated in Arizona, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, and bills to expand assisted suicide laws are being debated in Hawaii and Washington State. So this is an issue that is really being debated throughout the U.S. It's a major issue in many states. Now in Arkansas, I do not believe you've seen an assisted suicide bill yet. I might be wrong about that. But there's many states that have never had an assisted suicide bill who are now seeing one this year. So for instance, North Dakota has not debated assisted suicide. They've never had a bill. And now they have a sponsor in North Dakota who sponsored an assisted suicide bill, and they're debating it there. You have to understand that the assisted suicide lobby, their goal was, after legalizing in Oregon, and Dr. Toffler might mention this a little bit, but their goal was to try and make it look like it's safe. We're going to control it a bit in Oregon. By doing that, we can then in the future convince other states to legalize it and tell them, don't worry, everything's fine in Oregon. Well, you're going to find out that not everything is fine in the state of Oregon. So what they're doing now is they're actually trying to pick off other states that might not be, let's say, states that would normally be considered states that are open to the concept of assisted suicide. But what they're doing is they're trying to create more allies. For instance, in North Dakota, they obviously found a legislator who's on their side, and they're creating this relationship with that legislator because they may believe it's impossible for them to pass it now, but they're hoping that in a few years down the line, they will gain support to pass it also in places like North Dakota. We're very concerned about the bill in New York. We're very concerned about New Mexico, and I will tell you a little bit about the New Mexico bill. Those are states that we're very concerned about. Now, I mentioned here about the expansion bills. So just so you know, all these years they said, oh, assisted suicide, oh, there's no slippery slope. So they passed it in Oregon, and they kept the law the way it was. And they did that on purpose in order to convince other states. Well, in 2019, the assisted suicide lobby, on January 1st, actually, of 2019, the assisted suicide lobby announced that one of the problems with these laws is that they're too tight. And so since then, and you'll see it in my explanation, they're working hard to try and expand these laws. So let me give you a little bit of an insider information. If they were to present a bill in Arkansas, it would probably be an original type of Oregon bill, which looks like it's tight. They would probably do that. And they'd say, oh, we have safeguards, because safeguards are the flag they wave to convince people that it's okay to legalize. Safeguards are not meant to be there forever. They're just the way to legalize. That's how they do it. And then once it's legal, they wait a little bit and then they try and expand from there. I could tell you a lot about Canada, and I'm not going to, but we might have some time and I'll get into that. The media and the assisted suicide lobby, they want you to think that there's a tidal wave of support for this, that this is coming at us, that you can't resist this. Well, look at this. In 2017, there were 26 states that debated assisted suicide in 2017. All those bills were defeated, every single one of them in 2017. Last year, there was 20 assisted suicide bills and all were defeated. Now, last year was a little bit of a different year. I'll be honest, obviously last year with the COVID virus that shut down a lot of the legislatures, there were several places where we were very concerned that those states might legalize assisted suicide, but because of COVID and the shutting down of the state legislatures, it never happened. Nonetheless, there were 20 assisted suicide bills being debated last year. In the past few years, there's been several states that have strengthened their assisted suicide laws. So as much as you might be told by the media or being inundated by the media that, oh, this is coming at you, this is the future. Well, you know, Idaho, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arizona have all actually strengthened their assisted suicide bills in the past few years. And the courts have continued to maintain that there's no right to assisted suicide. And I'm not going to get into all the court thing, but what's important here is how do the laws work? I'm going to get into this a bit with you because one of the ways to fight assisted suicide is to talk about what it actually is, right? What is assisted suicide? They're going to make you think that this is all about, you know, people dying a peaceful death, and it's all about their personal choice, their autonomy. Well, how does this work? Well, a person must request a lethal dose. That's correct. The doctor would examine that person, the doctor that they would be meeting Most doctors don't want to do assisted suicide. So in fact, in most cases, someone requesting assisted suicide, for instance, in the state of Oregon, they might request it, and then what would happen is they'd be given a referral to the group Compassion and Choices, and Compassion and Choices would then set them up with a physician who's pro-assisted suicide. But nonetheless, the doctor who would then have to examine the person to determine if the person qualifies. A second doctor must ensure that that prognosis and decision for assisted suicide is correct. So what does this mean? Who's actually deciding? Yes, someone has to request the lethal dose. That's absolutely true. Who actually decides whether or not the person will die by assisted suicide? It's the physician. Or if these other laws pass in these other states, it'll be physician assistants, etc. too. I'm going to get into that in a minute. So it's actually the power of the law is actually in the hand of the person who makes the decision. And the person who makes the decision is not the requester, it's the person who's approving it and prescribing it. This is how the laws work. The person then must pick up the lethal dose from the pharmacy. Once the lethal dose is obtained from the pharmacy, there's no further oversight of the law. Now, why am I saying that? Why is that so important? So let's say someone asks for assisted suicide, and let's say they have a terminal condition. So we're going to grant them that. They have a terminal condition. They were approved for assisted suicide. They received their lethal dose. Now they are at home with their lethal dose. If that person dies by assisted suicide, did we know, is there any proof? Is there any third-party intervention to prove that the law was followed and this drug was given to them, not given to them, but they actually took it voluntarily? Is there any way to actually know? And the answer is, according to the law, no, there's no way to know. And I'll give you one other thing. If you look at these stats in Oregon, and in my rest of my presentation, I don't even put this in, but it's an important fact. The doctor is actually rarely at the death. So what happens is the doctor is rarely at the death. Who's usually there at the time of the death? It's usually the assisted suicide lobby volunteer. So with assisted suicide lobby, they have these volunteers that are trained to sit with you to help you take your lethal dose. It rarely is it the physician who's at your side. So the question then becomes, well, what happens if it doesn't go right? Was this actually a voluntary death? This is a very hard question because the law does not provide for any, as I say, third party, how would you say, independent person to ensure that the law was actually followed. Once the person dies, the physician who wrote the prescription must submit the report. So what does that mean? It's a self-reporting system. Dr. A approves the assisted suicide. Dr. B says, yes, the prognosis is correct, etc. Dr. A writes the lethal prescription. The person dies. Remember that the physician's rarely at the death. Once the person dies, the physician must send in the report. The physician was not at the death. So what's the physician doing? They're reporting what the medical condition of the person was, the age of the person, etc., etc. Now, if there was questionable issues related to that death, such as the person might have had issues related to depression, etc., but the physician thought it was acceptable to go ahead and do so anyway, is the physician going to self-report when there's questionable or abuse of the law? And the answer to that question is no. The physician does not self-report. Now, another thing about these reports, if you look at the assisted suicide reports from Oregon or Washington State, you'll notice that the data is actually very clinical, meaning it's the person was this age, they might have had a certain level of education. I'd like to put that in there, etc. Whether or not they had a hospice, they had been approved for hospice or something, that's in there also. Nonetheless, it's very clinical. It doesn't actually tell us more than that, but on top of it, if the person was depressed and was given that, there's no way that you would know. But on top of it, 6 months later, after the report has been received in Oregon and Washington State, where they've had assisted suicide longest, those reports are destroyed. So in fact, if something untoward did happen and someone wanted to investigate it, it would be very, very difficult. According to the 2019 assisted suicide report, there were 180 reported assisted deaths, which was up from 178 in 2018. 188. It's not a massive number, you would say, but every year those numbers go up. In 2019, the ingestion status was unknown in 58 deaths. Now, why is this important? So when you're looking at the data, for instance, in the Oregon report, it said in 2019 there was 188 reported assisted suicide deaths, and then it refers to the ingestion status. Well, some of these people hadn't died yet, so that's in there. It shows you so many people hadn't died yet, which is natural. They might have received their lethal drugs, for instance, on December 1st, and there was no death report yet at the time of the report because they simply had not died yet. So that's normal. There were some people who died a natural death. Well, that's also normal. The other side's going to tell you that about 1/3 of the drugs are only there beside the bed so someone can feel comfortable in case they need it. That's actually a lie, okay? It's a very tiny number, and most of the natural deaths that occur is because somebody was terminally ill and they actually just died naturally. They never were in pain. They never decided to take the drugs because there was never a reason for it. But then in the 2019 report, it says 58 deaths, the ingestion status was unknown. What does it mean? It means they know the person died, they just don't know how the person died. They don't know if it was an assisted suicide. They don't know if it was a natural death. They don't have a report. They simply don't know. In 2018, there was 43 of these unknown deaths in Oregon. So if you look at it, there's 101 of them over 2 years. All of those could be assisted suicide deaths that simply weren't reported. Maybe none of them were assisted suicide deaths that simply weren't reported. We don't know. But what kind of oversight are we talking about here? We're talking about people receiving lethal controlled substances, these drugs, lethal drugs, and we don't even have enough oversight to know how 58 of those deaths occurred. We don't know if they died by assisted suicide or not. 101 over 2 years. We just simply don't know. It's a ridiculous situation if you think about it, because we're talking about intentionally prescribing lethal controlled substances, and we don't know what happened. In 2019, one patient was referred for a psychological or psychiatric assessment. So what they're saying is, out of 188 reported assisted suicide deaths, remember 58 people died that they don't know how they died. We just don't know. Only one person was sent for a psychological or a psychiatric evaluation. So you're telling me only one person was deeply, deeply, deeply depressed. Only one person was going through what you call really deep, deep feelings of hopelessness to a point where their ability to consent was questionable. You're saying only one. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In 2019, one physician was referred to the Oregon Medical Board for failure to comply with the law. Only one physician was. I do have an article about that nonetheless. So the time of death was between 1 minute and 47 hours. The 1 minute I can't understand. The 47 hours, we're going to get into that, and Dr. Toffler's talk will cover that a bit too. Imagine that you expected to die a peaceful death, and then you laid in bed for 47 hours before you actually died. As I say, Dr. Toffler will get into that more. I'm going to mention that a bit. Washington State data. And why am I going through the data? I think it's important for you to see some of this stuff to have it really jump out at you. The Washington State report indicated that there was a 25% increase in assisted suicide deaths in 2018. It said that there was 203 reported assisted suicide deaths in 2018, which is up from 164 in 2017. It said that there was 267 lethal prescriptions dispensed, which was up from 212 in 2017. 29 known natural deaths. Okay. 16 deaths, the status was pending. Well, that makes sense. Someone might have received their prescription in October, November, December, or simply hadn't died yet. Okay. 19 unknown deaths. Once again, 19 unknown deaths. Now, the number is lower in Washington State, percentage-wise, than in Oregon. And if you look through the yearly reports, you see in Oregon, every year that number seems to be going up, the number of unknown deaths. Why is this? That you can have 19 people who you know they died, you just don't know how they died when you prescribed them lethal drugs. Does this sound like a safe system? Think about this. You're talking about lethal. Does this sound safe? No, this doesn't sound safe. Does this sound like it's a system that's being well regulated? No, it's not a system that's well regulated. 19 unknown deaths may be unreported suicide deaths. Could very well be. And there are more complications in the 28 report in Washington State. And this is likely due to these new lethal drug cocktail experiments, because Washington State was a key state for those experiments. And Dr. Toffler will talk about that. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information. But in 2018, there was 8 people who reportedly experienced complications. Now remember, there was 203 reported assisted suicide deaths, so which was up from 164. So there was 8 people who had experienced complications, which was up from 4 in 2017. What's important about this is, remember, the reports come in from the physician who prescribed the lethal drugs. So therefore, is the physician going to report complications? Not all the time. Do physicians report when they have done something which is questionable? Probably not. Why would you want to be brought before some tribunal to have to answer for something if you can simply fill out the report and make it look clean? Also, 62 people, this is in 2018, 62 people died more than 90 minutes after taking the lethal drugs, and the range of time to die was from 7 minutes to 30 hours in 2018. 7 minutes to 30 hours. 30 hours. Sounds like a death with dignity, doesn't it, my friends? 30 hours of laying there with these lethal drugs in your system before you actually die. So let me give you a bit of information. I'm not going to cover this too much. This is not my topic, but I think I should wet your whistle, because then you'll be really interested in Dr. Toffler's talk. Dr. Toffler is an amazing physician who's been involved with this issue for many years, and he's one of the best speakers on this issue that I've ever met in my life. Nonetheless, in March of 2017, the Seattle Times, Washington State, right, reported that the assisted suicide lobby was working on these experiments to develop a lower cost, effective way to kill. So that's what the assisted suicide lobby has been doing. They've been working on trying to find a cheaper way to kill, a cheaper, effective way to kill. So the first experiments, they said, were too harsh. Patients had burning mouths and throats, causing them to scream in pain. Now they're selling this to us as death with dignity, and yet people were dying, screaming in pain. I guess this is not really concerned about actually caring for the pain of an individual. The second drug mix that came up, because obviously the first one didn't work, led to these stretched out long deaths. One case took 31 hours. In fact, it wasn't just the long deaths. There's other things related to that. So they're having serious side effects with their lethal drug experiments. An advocacy organization called End of Life Washington State, again, briefly advised prescribing a drug mixture with a sedative chlorohydrate to about 70 patients. And Robert Wood, the medical director of the organization, said it worked, but there was a tragic catch. In a few cases, the chlorohydrate burned people's throats, causing severe pain just at the time they were expecting relief. So, you know, I say this to you because I run this Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and I get emails from people and phone calls from people, and they tell me that I'm a horrible person because I'm opposed to giving people relief at the end of life, which is, of course, not true at all. I've got no interest in anybody suffering at the end of life. That's not my interest whatsoever. I want you to be properly cared for. I have no interest in your suffering. Nonetheless, the assisted suicide lobby, which claims they're all about dying with dignity, would put people through this. They put 70 patients through this. They couldn't stop their experiment after they saw a few people dying in these horrible deaths. They had to continue. And then the Medical Express in September 8, 2020 reported a little known secret not publicized by advocates of aid in dying was that while most deaths were speedy, others were very slow. Some patients lingered for 6 to 9 hours or more, a few more than 3 days. I mentioned that the one Oregon case was 47 hours. Assisted suicide clearly is not what it appears to be. So they're going to try and sell it in your state and then in every state based on these are people who are suffering, and we are going to give them a safe and a kind and a dignified death. Remember, people support assisted suicide based on the fear of dying a bad death. People are asking for this out of fear. You know, a lot of the things that we have to understand is there are people who let me give you an example. And this is an old piece of data, but nonetheless, it's very pertinent. In 2008, they had the plebiscite in Washington State, which legalized assisted suicide. And in the U.S., as you know, you have after during the election day, there's always these exit polls. and they did exit polling. And one of the questions in the exit poll was on the assisted suicide referendum, right? The plebiscite question. And 29% of the people who said they voted in favor of assisted suicide said they were pro-life. 50% of the people who voted in favor of assisted suicide referred to themselves as Christians. Now, or that they attended church, etc. Now, we all know that there are people, of course, who might be Christian and have a difficulty with their faith base, etc. You know, there's lots of people come from different perspectives. I understand this, but we have to understand the nature of the human person. People fear dying. There's a lot of people who support assisted suicide, not because they think it's a wonderful idea, but they're in deep fear of having a bad death. And the assisted suicide lobby plays on that. You know, what made the Brittany Maynard story, you might remember that story. It actually is what led to the legalization of assisted suicide in California. And it was a few years ago that Brittany, who lived in California, moved to the state of Oregon because she had had a brain tumor. She moved to the state of Oregon so she could die by assisted suicide in Oregon. Well, the Brittany Maynard story was very powerful because it dealt with two issues. One, she was young and she was terminal. She had been beautiful. She had just been married recently. They wanted to have a family, but look how she was suffering. Like, there's a lot of emotion to this story, and it was an effective emotional story. But also, it really played on the fact that people fear dying a bad death, because she was telling the story that her alternative, she said, was a horrific death. And whether that was true or not was not even the issue, because that was the story they had. The committee was looking at the quote safeguards. enough doctors to do it, well, get some physician assistants to do it. It also expands the list of who can counsel. Now, I don't really understand this. And I think, once again, what they're trying to do is just make it easier for this all just to be, done. I'm going to give you another reason why I think they're doing this. Because as you noticed in my data, in Oregon in 2018, there was only one person sent for a psychiatric or psychological assessment. So why do you need to expand who can be involved with counseling? Counseling is only done, because remember the laws, none of the assisted suicide laws require counseling. All of them state that if there is then a question about one's ability to consent, meaning they're very depressed, they might have some early stage Alzheimer, dementia, etc. If there's questionable consent, then they would be sent for this assessment. They're deeply depressed, etc. Right? So why expand it if there's so few people being sent for psychiatric psychological assessments? I don't know why they're doing that, but nonetheless, they're making it easier for who can do that counseling. I'm going to make this comment right off the bat. I think what they're actually doing here is they're making it easier for them to set up assisted suicide clinics. In Switzerland, they have assisted suicide clinics. In the US, you don't have, that I know of, other than Lonnie Shavels in California. You don't really have assisted suicide clinics. But by setting it up where you have lesser qualified people involved with the act, you're not only making it more available, it's obviously a lot cheaper to have a licensed physician assistant involved rather than a physician. I'm just saying to you, it seems to me that these changes make it easier to have an assisted suicide clinic. So I think that's part of their future visioning. We're going to have assisted suicide clinics in Washington State, Oregon, etc. They're going to eliminate the 15-day waiting period, and they're replacing it with a 72-hour waiting period. If that isn't enough, they're going to allow waiving of the 72-hour waiting period. So let's say Alex has been approved for assisted suicide, and it looks like I'm really close to death already. So instead of waiting 72 hours to give me the lethal, currently it's a 15-day waiting period. Instead of waiting 72 hours to give me the lethal drugs, they would allow a same-day death if the doctor waives the 72-hour waiting period. Now let me ask you a question. If I'm that close to death, why not just care for my pain and symptoms and let me die? Like, honestly, why do I need to receive lethal drugs if I'm that close to death? I think we have to be brutally honest about these things. This is about allowing a same-day death. See, once you say we can waive the 72-hour waiting period, then the question becomes, well, what circumstances? And we have to also remember it's the person prescribing the assisted suicide drugs that sends in the report. If a certain physician is always waiving the 72-hour waiting period, I guarantee you they're going to be claiming every time that this person was really looking like they were near to death. Self-reporting, right? Studies with people who are dying conclude that the will to live fluctuates. This is very, very important. They did studies on people with cancer who were dying, and what they did is they visited them every day and they spoke to them every day, and the purpose of the study was the will to live. So someone might say on Tuesday, if there were lethal drugs, I would take it. And what's happening is maybe they got a really bad prognosis on Tuesday and they're really feeling down, or maybe their wife gave them some bad news on Tuesday and they're really, really feeling down. But then they were speaking to that same person on Thursday and the person said, no, I want to live as long as I can. Now, why did the will to live fluctuate? Because as human beings, that's a normal reality for us. Our emotions, our psychological, our spiritual nature, we change every day over time, and we change with the circumstances. The studies prove that. So for instance, if a grandchild came to visit, then the person would be saying the next day, of course I want to live, because they're happy they saw their grandchild. The will to live fluctuates. Very few people in those studies actually maintained a feeling that I want to die. But if you allow a same-day death, then a person's bad day becomes their last day. They die because they didn't get a chance to have a better day the next day. HB 1141, this is the Washington State bill to, they're going to allow the lethal assisted suicide drugs to be delivered rather than you having to pick it up or your physician picking it up. Now, this is very important, I think. Let's think this through. Drugs packages are getting stolen all the time during COVID. We're hearing this in the news all the time. So you're going to allow these lethal drugs to be delivered. But let's go to the next step. This is a lethal drug, controlled substance being delivered to your door. Who then is in control of these drugs? Like, what's actually happening here? This to me seems a little bit ridiculous. We're not talking about, whatever. We are talking about lethal drugs. If passed, this would open the door to expanding assisted suicide in the US, because if the Washington state bill passes, then what happens is other states would follow this direction, okay? Now let's be brutally honest of how this works. The existing approval and reporting system already denies effective oversight of the law. I already explained. The law already allows the same physician to approve assisted suicide, who then prescribes assisted suicide, who is then the same physician who's required to send in the report. This is a self-reporting system. This is not a system with third-party oversight, right? Where we already have a system where effective oversight of the law is missing. The self-reporting system is for what reason? It protects physicians. It does not protect the patient. Now, this makes a lot of sense. Why does this make sense? Physicians are not going to be involved with assisted suicide if they have fear that somehow the law might come back at them. Let's say they do something which was inappropriate. If they fear that a family member might make a complaint which might get them in trouble, remember, we're talking about causing death here, they're not going to be involved with assisted suicide. So in order to protect the physician, to ensure that they're willing to participate, the law provides complete protection for them. Anyway, the self-reporting system will not be just for physicians, it'll be also then for qualified medical providers. Okay. Assisted suicide promoters and practitioners develop these lethal drug cocktails by doing human trials rather than animal trials. Once again, as I said, Dr. Toffler will get into this. I'm making this point that consent is a real question here. Because somebody has been approved for assisted suicide and consented to receive these lethal drugs does not mean they've actually consented to be part of a lethal drug trial. I think there's two very different issues. So this is what's going on. Now you have to also understand that Washington State's now following the decision that happened in Oregon. So in 2019, Oregon passed Bill SB 0579, which essentially eliminated the 15-day waiting period. So what you're getting is a situation of one state, then the next state, then the next state. Now, why is this important? Oh, I'm going to also refer to Hawaii. So this is what's crazy about Hawaii. Why am I going through all this? Because I want you to know that they have a game plan, okay? And the game plan is very clear. Hawaii legalized assisted suicide in 2018. It came into law on January 1st, 2019. That means assisted suicide has only been legal in Hawaii for 2 years. 2 years, that's it, okay? In the 2019 assisted suicide report, the Hawaii Department of Health recommended the following changes to the law: to waive the waiting periods if the attending provider believes that the death is likely soon, and also giving healthcare providers, it recommended adding that to advanced practice registered nurses also, and attending providers being advanced practice registered nurses. So Hawaii was suggesting in the report, the assisted suicide report, that they should be expanding the law to allow more people to do the act and get rid of the waiting periods. So there's a bill right now in Hawaii. It's called SB 323. And what's the bill for? Expanding the Hawaii assisted suicide law. Now, it's only been legal there for 2 years. They've only killed a few people so far. I'm not saying there's nothing but only about killing. I should be very careful about that. That's true. The point is, they're expanding the law already. Talking about the ink on the law was barely dry before they tried to expand the law. Now, I think this is also important. Hawaii had assisted suicide bills, and I've been doing this now for 21 years. Dr. Toffler's been at this longer than me, but I've been at this for 21 years. Hawaii was debating assisted suicide bills nearly every year in the legislature, and we kept on defeating those bills year after year after year after year. Finally, they passed their law because they said, oh, we've got safeguards, and now they're going to eliminate the safeguards right away. New Mexico's bill. Now, why is this important? I don't have to go through all this situation. They started out from the beginning by defining who can do it as healthcare providers. And who are the healthcare providers? Physicians, licensed physician assistants, osteopathic physicians, and nurses registered in advanced practice. So right off the bat, New Mexico's following the Washington State example, okay? Right off the bat. So this is, how would you say, the new type of assisted suicide laws, expanding who can do it. They've also got in there expanding who can counsel. Same thing as in Washington State. Then also they put in here, they waive the requirement that a person's conviction, so this is clearly a New Mexico only thing so far, but Section 3G of the bill says it waives the requirement that a person's condition be confirmed by a second healthcare provider if the requester is enrolled in a hospice program. So by enrolling in a hospice program in New Mexico, then it doesn't require a second physician to be, or in this case, as I say, healthcare provider, to be approving the assisted suicide. They're saying that if you're in a hospice program, we accept that you must be dying. You got to understand here that a hospice program, to enroll into it, is a different issue than actually being treated in a hospice program. You know, receiving hospice treatment for pain and symptom management means that you need pain and symptom management treatment. If you're enrolled in a program, it means that it could mean very well that you're expecting in the near future you might need hospice help, but it doesn't mean you're actually receiving help from hospice at this moment. But that would waive the requirement. The bill in New Mexico is a 48-hour waiting period rather than a 15-day waiting period. 48 hours. I told you Washington State, the amendment bill, the changing bill would make it 72 hours. This would be 48 hours, but then you can also waive the waiting period. Once again, same day death. Same day death is possible if the New Mexico bill passes. Clearly, the assisted suicide lobby is trying to expand assisted suicide laws in the US. Clearly, they're saying the time has come for us to make this a wider regime. Now, I'm not getting into Canada yet, and maybe I should in a second, just to scare you a little bit. Assisted suicide bills are in Arizona, Indiana, Iowa, and Kansas follow a traditional Oregon-style bill. That's what's going on right now. So these bills that are being right now debated in Arizona, Indiana, Iowa, and Kansas, they're like an older style Oregon bill because they want to legalize assisted suicide before they first try and amend it, because they know it's going to be very difficult to legalize in those states. Clearly, these bills are written in a tighter manner with the hope of passing the bill than expanding the law in the future. So once again, as I say, the safeguards are the flag they wave in order to get the bills passed. They don't care about safeguards. Lord have mercy, they don't care about that. What they actually care about is getting assisted suicide legal. New York has an assisted suicide study bill. They also have a legalization bill right now in New York. So there's two bills in New York. So what they're saying in New York is, if we can't get the bill through to legalize assisted suicide, then at least let's get the study bill through, okay? Remember, you don't need to study assisted suicide if you don't intend to legalize it. We have enough information out of Oregon, etc., to know what assisted suicide is all about. Fighting assisted suicide. I guess this was actually meant to be my topic. So let's say we go through this. We need to call it what it is. A lot of people want to call it aid in dying. You know, they call it doctor prescribed death. They want to call it other things, physician assisted death. In Canada, it's medical aid in dying. They want you to make it sound like it's something that it's not, in order for you to feel more comfortable with it. This is assisting a suicide. The definition is correct. When someone dies by assisted suicide, it's because somebody assisted them by providing them the lethal drugs that they took themselves, okay? They allow the doctor to be directly involved with causing another person's death. These laws allow then exceptions to homicide or manslaughter. Any laws that create exceptions to homicide or manslaughter. Now, manslaughter is a term used in some states. It's it's certainly a term used in Canada. These are bad ideas. You don't want anyone to have the right in law to be involved with causing your death. And I just used the term involved with, because obviously, if it's truly an assisted suicide, you'd be actually causing your own death. The term aid in dying is used for both euthanasia and assisted suicide. So you need to understand this. The assisted suicide lobby is changing their own terms, and they're calling it aid in dying. Now, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because they're getting ready for euthanasia. When you look at the term aid in dying, that doesn't mean assisted suicide. It means euthanasia and assisted suicide. We need to talk about what it is. The other side claims that these are deaths with dignity. You know, they describe them as peaceful, quick, painless. And we know many of these deaths are not peaceful, not quick, and they're certainly not painless. So what am I getting to also? When we're focusing on the issue of assisted suicide, a lot of people want to talk about other things. I'll give you an example. I was just on the New Mexico, as I said, the New Mexico committee hearings, and quite a few people were arguing against assisted suicide, so that was wonderful. And they would make arguments like, well, this is not necessary, we can control pain, etc., etc. All of that's true. It's not necessary. Yes, we can control pain, but first of all, we should never focus on pain itself, because people are asking for assisted suicide based on what? Fear of a painful death, fear of a bad death, fear. Fear is what's driving them. So when we're arguing against this, we have to talk about what it actually is. You're actually giving a physician the right law to cause my death, to be involved with causing my death. You're actually doing something which is not safe, which should never be legal. It should never be legal for someone to be involved with causing my death. And we're also talking about people in a vulnerable time of their life. How do I define vulnerable? I define vulnerable based on me as a human person. So a lot of us made mistakes years ago talking about assisted suicide and euthanasia, that we referred to vulnerable in a way of someone who, let's say, has a disability, someone who's very, very elderly, and let's say they're frail elderly. And we weren't thinking actually that we're all vulnerable. All these laws make us vulnerable. Dr. Toffler in Oregon, whether he likes it or not, is vulnerable because he has a state that's legalized assisted suicide. Why is he vulnerable? Because he's human. We all go through the same human emotions to different degrees, the same feelings to different degrees. We all share the same reality, that we all fear these situations. It's not uncommon that if I'm going through a terminal condition, or if I'm going through a significant medical condition, that I'm also affected by that in a psychological, social, spiritual, emotional way. It's normal for someone to maybe become depressed when they're going through these conditions. It's not that they're terrible people. It's that they are human beings who are going through normal feelings in these times of distress. So when you legalize assisted suicide, you're actually putting these people at their time of need, you're putting their life at stake here. We all become vulnerable. These laws are what make us vulnerable. It's not that vulnerable people, it's that these laws affect us at a vulnerable time of our life. The disability point of view is absolutely also correct. They say that because of disability attitudes towards people with disabilities, or disability itself, they would say that how come we are being offered assisted suicide in this medical condition, whereas somebody who's able-bodied might be offered suicide prevention? And I think they're absolutely correct, because there's an attitude within the culture that certain conditions or certain lives are not worth living. We should not focus on palliative care. So I'm sorry if you're a palliative care physician, I'm not putting it down. The problem with focusing on palliative care, as much as palliative care is needed, it's necessary, it's important, it's absolutely necessary that we have effective palliative care that's available for people. The fact is, if we focus on palliative care, it doesn't actually solve the problem of the people requesting assisted suicide because they're fearing a bad death. But the assisted suicide lobby will say, oh, we support palliative care, but we also recognize that sometimes there might be a condition. So they're dealing with that hypothetical might be condition. And they say, in those rare circumstances, assisted suicide would be necessary or helpful if someone were to want it. So when we're focusing on palliative care, we're focusing on pain, but it's the pain that people fear. And the other side will say, only in those extreme circumstances, so they would say we also support palliative care. So a lot of times we want to say, oh, this isn't necessary because we have palliative care. Well, we don't have enough palliative care. I agree with that 100% without a question. Nonetheless, that's not what we should be focusing on. We're focusing on the fact of what this is, what it does, how it affects me, how the law in Oregon, how can you have 101 people over 2 years where you don't know what happened? We know that they got the lethal drugs. We just don't know what happened to them. That's insane. Now, what kind of oversight is that? That's absolutely ridiculous. But you know, those who support assisted suicide are so into the concept of assisted suicide that these are just little points to them that they want to ignore. But for the person who is thinking about it and sort of struggling with it, when you start talking about how the law actually works, how these assisted suicide drugs actually work, that really affects them. And the fact is that this is actually about causing death. You should never be allowing someone else to be involved with causing death. We should talk about these lethal drug experiments. I'm surprised that so few people talk about it. I talk about it. Dr. Toffler talks about it. There's a few others who have talked about it, and everyone else says, "Well, you know, we want to ignore that because, well, these experiments that we're doing. As I said, this is Dr. Toffler's talking points, so maybe I should move on. But they certainly prohibit the Nuremberg Ethics Code prohibited human experimentation without proper consent. And the Nuremberg Ethics Code also prohibited human experimentation that causes death. These experiments are absolutely ridiculous. We must work with people from all political points of view. There's not one silver bullet to prevent the passage of a euthanasia or an assisted suicide bill. People with disabilities have personal experience that needs to be heard by politicians. It's a very important thing to talk about stories. The other side has stories galore. It's important that we also share stories. People with disabilities talking about being denied medical treatment. You would say, isn't that a different issue? Well, it can be, but it also talks about the discrimination they experience. And now you're talking about assisted suicide, which is life and death. We must encourage people to work together, but never discourage people from working on their own. I think it's very important, but we should work together, but there are many different ways to fight assisted suicide laws, and we must accept that. Don't hesitate to talk about the changes of the law in Canada. I didn't get into that. Maybe I should have. All I can say to you is we legalized euthanasia in 2016. Within 4 years of legalizing, our Parliament started debating Bill C7, which eliminates the waiting period. It also eliminates the need to be terminal. It also, what it does is it allows incompetent people to die by euthanasia. And yes, Canada has euthanasia. It's not assisted suicide. It's euthanasia. It's lethal injection. And there's only one honest thing they did in Canada. The one honest thing is the law legalizing euthanasia, they call it MAID, nonetheless, it's euthanasia, is an exception in the criminal code to homicide. So if you want to find Canada's euthanasia law, or MAID law, you go to the Homicide Act, section 241 of the criminal code, and you're going to find you're not allowed to kill someone, but then there's the exception. It's called MAID. So at least that's honest. They recognize it to be homicide, because that's what it is. It's murder. There's no other question about it. Like the Netherlands and Belgium, Canada's talking about expanding euthanasia now for children. The Netherlands announced in October that they plan to expand euthanasia for children. Belgium already has done that. Canada's talking about that. Canada's talking about incompetent people who have made an advanced request. This is where it goes. Once you've legalized it, let's get this down right now. Once you've legalized killing, the only thing you're now debating is the reasons why you can do it and the rules around it. That's all. Because you've crossed the line. There's only one line. Am I allowed to kill or not allowed to kill? That's the line. Once you cross that line, we're just debating the rules for it now. So we're talking about incompetent people who've made an advanced request. So people might put it in their power of attorney, or in their wills, living wills, that they would want euthanasia in a certain condition. They're talking about allowing euthanasia for that in Canada. People with Alzheimer's, dementia, people with mental illness. This is the big thing. Our Justice Minister announced in November, just a few months ago, to our Justice Committee in the Senate that he wanted to expand euthanasia to include people with mental illness. He told them that the only reason it was not in our current bill to expand euthanasia. I know it's 3 o'clock, so I'm done. They're trampling on conscience rights. He said the only reason they didn't put mental illness in the current bill is he didn't have time to do it. Craziness. And so conscience rights are an important issue. And there's my information. And if anybody wants to be sent my PowerPoint, we can send my PowerPoint to them. I'm going to press stop share because we're going to introduce Dr. Toffler. And he is so Dr. Toffler is now able to share his screen and put up his own PowerPoint. Dr. Toffler is a physician in Oregon, and he's been involved with a group called Physicians for Compassionate Care. If you are a physician, whether you live in Arkansas or wherever, it's a very good idea to become a member of Physicians for Compassionate Care. They've become the experts for many reasons. One is they've been involved with this issue for a very long time. But people like Dr. Toffler have been in this debate for, well, I won't say how long, because he's an amazing young looking man. But nonetheless, the point of it is these people know these issues inside and out, and he's gonna talk to you about what's actually happening. Thank you. I'm passing the baton to Dr. Toffler.
So thank you again, Alex. I appreciate all you do. And I think Alex has been a huge supporter, not only of our efforts with Physicians for Compassionate Care, but he's working internationally, as am I. I've been to Rome, Italy with Alex. I've been to Australia trying to keep the dark side of end-of-life care from going into Australia. And I want to give you hope, because as Alex said, there have been lots of efforts to make this be a domino effect, as I said in the beginning. In fact, Derek Humphrey, who was really the father of assisted suicide in the United States, predicted that we've taken the first step here in Oregon. We're going to go off into euthanasia, and it's going to be all the states are going to fall like dominoes. So I'm going to give you some data to add to what Alex has said about the whole issue. But I do invite all the people who are in all related medically, whether you're a nurse, you're a physician assistant, a doctor, to go to our website, Physicians for Compassionate Care Education Foundation. That's pccef.org. You can join without paying dues. We have voluntary dues, and somehow we get along on that shoestring, and have been in existence now for 26 years. And trying to keep the genie in the bottle is impossible. On the other hand, we've kept it bottled up in Oregon here for 10 or 11 years, and then we managed to keep the majority of states from not going south, if you will. Although I should say the South is one of the best places in terms of clarity of thought with respect to excellent end-of-life care. So the goals today, just to cover some of the so-called death with dignity. I always want to use so-called when you're using these euphemisms, because you don't want to carry water for the devil, so to speak. And the reality is that all social engineering is preceded by verbal engineering. What Alex said about these euphemisms that are used is to make it more palatable. When you do polls and you use these euphemisms, the favorability rating goes up 10 to 15%. And that's why the death movement desperately doesn't want us to be using clear language, as Alex said, assisted suicide, which is the King's English about what we're talking about. A doctor or someone else is assisting someone else in killing themselves. That's the King's English. The euphemisms are used to drive social change. And unfortunately, they're very effective if you don't unmask them. So you, as people who recognize the inherent value of human life at all stages, don't use these euphemisms ever. At the very least, say so-called death with dignity, so-called medical aid in dying. By the way, I believe in aiding the dying. I just don't believe in killing the dying. So there you have it. So I want to cover some of the shift in the drugs used and what's behind that, the unethical research that's been going on by people in the left coast states, that's Washington, Oregon, California, the efficacy in killing that comes with these because of the failure. That's what's driving them to do this so-called research. It's really not research. It's not ethical. It's not going by human subject review boards, which all the research that I've done in my academic career, you would have to go and pass the scrutiny of people, so we don't go back into the dark days of the 20th century with Nazi underwater experiments and killing, because, well, these people are going to die anyhow. We might as well learn something from them. As Alex said, there's clearly continued problems with oversight. And really, I want to express this thought. And I think our two pre-speakers can pick up on it. If you look at the root word, compassion means willingness to suffer with people. That's Dame Cicely Saunders, that is Mother Teresa, that is true hospice and true palliative care that is actually trying to help people to live well until they die naturally. When we say someone comes to me or anyone else and asks for a lethal drug, and I say, well, I'll help you to kill yourself, it's really dispassionate care. I don't care whether you live or die. It's up to you. I'm simply a vending machine, and it's your choice. And then most importantly, I'm going to get to this next slide here, which is a little busier, but the one thing I want to point out when you look at on the left are the reasons why the promoters of assisted suicide say that this is okay, and on the right are the reasons why it is not okay. So I'll go through the ones for it. You've heard some of these already from Alex. But for the first time in my academic career, I heard a psychiatrist some 20 years ago talk about the so-called rational suicide. Well, if you believe in the inherent value of human life, there is no such thing. I mean, it's basically, as Alex said, sometimes people are down. Literally 25% of the people requesting assisted suicide by a formal academic study by one of my colleagues at Oregon Health and Science University, Linda Ganzini, showed that 25% of people requesting assisted suicide met the criteria for major depressive disorder. Now, I'm really good at treating depression, and when I do, people change their mind. They essentially have different feelings if I work with them over time. 23% met the criteria for anxiety disorder. So you have documented that people's lives may be at risk in that study by one of my colleagues, who, by the way, claims that she's neutral on assisted suicide. Well, you really can't be neutral about assisted suicide. You can't be neutral about child abuse. You can't be neutral about slavery. You can't be neutral about wife beating. The reality is that when you're neutral, you're saying, well, I'm not opposed to it under all circumstances. You can either be opposed to it, like me and most of the people on this call, presumably, or you can be for it. But if you say you're neutral, you're not for it. So the double negative makes it you're for it in some circumstances. I learned this the hard way when one time I agreed to a debate with someone who was opposed to it. And then Linda Ganzini, that same person who did that study, was the neutral party we were presenting in front of the Psychiatric Association of Oregon. And I realized this, Linda Ganzini said, well, most of the time I don't think this is a good idea, but under some circumstances I can see it. So it was at least a debate against 1.5 to 1, or maybe 2 to 1, because one was enthusiastically for it and the other person was somewhat for it under some circumstances. So I never again from that time ever agreed to a debate with somebody who was neutral. I'd agree to a 1-on-1 debate or a 2-on-2, but that's a problem. So as Alex said, there really is no reason for intractable pain, because if you actually survey people, and this is over 20 years, both Washington and Oregon data, it's the fear of pain. It's actually not pain that drives it. Number 6 out of the top reasons. The top 5 reasons are, you want autonomy, you're afraid of being a burden on others and the like. And so you need to shoot down the notion of intractable pain as the reason, because there are palliative care doctors on this call and they're excellent at it. I personally have never had to use the ultimate goal, which would be to give people palliative sedation and then let them wake up and see if we can control their pain again. That's a legitimate thing. I personally, in my 40 plus years as a doctor, I think I'm up to 43 or thereabouts, have ever had to do that. So we're so good at it now that it's the fear of pain. Well, you can't change people's fear. If they're fearful, they're fearful. You try to do your best, but ultimately feelings are spontaneous interactions that you can't control. You can do your best to try to assuage them personally or as a counselor, as a guide, but you can't change them. I can't, if you continue to feel angry about X, Y, or Z, I can try to help you mitigate that. If you feel hopeless, I can do my best to mitigate that. But ultimately, they're feelings, they're spontaneous interactions. So I want to say it's fundamentally incompatible with our role as healer. And if you're going to pick one objection to this, that would be it. And the secular argument or apologetics for the reason I'm opposed to assisted suicide. The analogy I use is, suppose I was a lawyer defending you in a capital crime case where you're literally going to go to the death penalty and the like. And so lawyers know this, not doctors seem to not understand this problem. They would never cross over the aisle, and you would certainly be very confused if your defense lawyer, me, crossed over and started working on the prosecution for you and your death penalty. You'd say, well, of course that's an inherent conflict of interest, and lawyers would never touch that with a 10-foot pole. But on the other hand, if you're not bothered by that conflict of interest with your provider, because you say, well, doctors are different. They can see things on both sides and they can make the judgment. Well, they're also the judge to see which set of arguments the prosecution or the defense is best. So if you're not bothered by the fact that they're the judge deciding which set of arguments is right, they're also the executioner. So one of the most powerful arguments in our testimony at the Oregon Medical Association years ago, in 1997, to reverse being neutral, Oregon Medical Association reversed it, was a dean who came up to the microphone and he said, you know, if you're going to accept this as a society, you should perhaps have somebody besides doctors do it. And that was a really good argument that has stuck with me ever since, to say the inherent conflict of interest is absolutely a problem. And whenever people stand to make money with a death, when they make life easier for themselves with a death, and this gets at some of the problems with family members sometimes who, when you think about what do they have to gain by their dear loved one's death, and this is a problem, and I'll share some stories about that. As Alex said, stories are very powerful. They allow people to realize what is behind this. It seems all clean and nice with the language being used and all, but it's not. So how people were fooled. This is a timeline for passage in the United States. In '92, there was a ballot measure in California. Derek Humphrey was behind it. He was actually shocked that it almost passed, 54 to 46. So they tried it again in Washington State the very next year. And oddly enough, it failed again, very close. But both of those measures involved doctors being able to inject people. And it was too easy for ads to be put up in black and white with a doctor drawing up a lethal prescription and showing that it was going to be really the doctor doing it and not somebody doing it themselves. Well, they learned from that. And of course, they modified the measure in Oregon. And in 1994, the seriously flawed ballot measure 16 passed very narrowly, 51 to 49. We tried our best as physicians in Oregon to reverse course, to get away from the neutral, the deadly neutral position of the Oregon Medical Association, which gave then the legislators backbone to actually bring the measure back to the public. They didn't have the backbone to actually overrule the ballot measure, the plebiscite, but they did have the backbone to at least bring it back to a vote. And unfortunately, the position then became, you're going against the will of the people. Really very little conversation about the ballot measure itself or the merit or demerit of assisted suicide. Rather, it was, you're going against the will of the people. And we actually lost that 60 to 40. And ultimately it went into law after being tied up in the courts for about 3 years. And basically it said, you know, the people who were advocating for the law being unconstitutional or illegal, the Ninth Circuit Court said that the people saying that didn't have any standing. I guess you have to be dead to have ability to speak against this as, from a legal point of view. So within a year, there were 15 deaths in Oregon. I just show this slide because you see the latest data is 2019. 2020 won't come out until next month from the Oregon Health Authority, who keeps track of the second and third hand reports that Alex talked about. But you can see it went up over tenfold in that 20 plus year period. And it's going to continue to rise based on international studies of other places. I show you this map because when we say the states by name, it's a little harder to see how many states don't have it. You see the entire left coast is somewhat of a lost cause. Alex mentioned Montana passed by a single judge who basically said it's not unconstitutional in the state of there's nothing in the Constitution of Montana's Constitution that would prevent a doctor from having a defense if they went ahead and did assisted suicide. And in fact, they have one doctor there, at least that I know of, that's doing it, but it's relatively a handful of cases in contrast with Washington, Oregon, California, and certainly in contrast with our neighbors to the north, our brothers and sisters in Canada, who looked at Oregon and they found that, well, there are lingering deaths that Alex actually talked about, and I'll talk about a bit. And well, they went straight to euthanasia, realizing that Oregon's experiment, even though it's publicized as going swimmingly, they said, this is really inefficient. If you want to end somebody's life actively, which they are doing in Canada in spades, then you basically have to do the exact same thing with the same 3 drugs that you use in killing convicted axe murderers that are undergoing a death penalty. That is, you give somebody an anti-anxiety medication injection, then you follow that by a sedative, and then third, you give a paralyzing agent that keeps them from breathing and stops their heart muscle and their diaphragm from breathing, and they die because they can't breathe and their heart's not working. So it's interesting because most people are really circumspect about the death penalty. They invoke issues about uncertainty about did they really do the crime. People are exculpated later, years later, because of DNA evidence and all that. And, you know, I'm not arguing for or against the death penalty. I'm just simply saying there are solid reasons, I think, on both sides for arguing for it. And society has to decide if you can avoid the death penalty in a first world society, keep that person safe from themselves and others, or is it something that is a deterrent? And that's really open for debate. And it depends on the circumstances, I guess, in which country you are, as you can keep people safe or not. I lean toward the fact we can keep people safe in the United States, although with the current trend to release people from prison, even when they have been guilty of major felonies, whether it's fear of COVID or they just don't like the idea of prisons, I don't know, but I'm a little nervous about that. So again, that's not what we're talking about, but it's interesting that this so-called compassion of giving people lethal injections is compassionate in the case of a Canadian view of it, so-called compassionate. And then when you talk about, you know, the death penalty, it's immoral. You sort of say, my head's about to explode. This is crazy. So, you know, is there a domino effect like Derek Humphrey said years ago, 20 years ago? Well, you know, between 1994, when it passed in Oregon, and February of 2020, the latest data, there have been 284 proposals in the United States to legalize assisted suicide. More than 43 states and the District of Columbia involved in this. And yet over and over again, as Alex said, the bills were defeated, tabled, or withdrawn by the sponsors, or languished with no action taken. So I want you to know your efforts, and particularly proactively, like Arkansas is doing now with this meeting, are critical. So you don't get fooled. You can be active right away. You can, particularly in medical organizations or religious circles, whether it's Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, it doesn't really matter. You have to be active to not let them say, oh, this is just religious arguments if you're a religious organization, or that there's only religious arguments from a medical point of view. There are strong arguments against this, against the society embracing this, to avoid the conflict of interest, the inherent conflict of interest. And it absolutely needs to be, you have to be proactive. That's why I encourage all of you to go to the pcceef.org website, join us, and continue to be informed, not just today, but indefinitely, because as Alex very clearly said, this is not going away, and they are learning with their defeats. They learn more and more. It's almost like the Russian space program. You know, they had hundreds of rockets blow up and lost a lot of cosmonauts, but they learned from their mistakes, and ultimately they were the first ones in space. And I see the same kind of learning by the promoters of assisted suicide and death. So why did this pass? You know, the euphemisms I've talked about, but I want you to be aware that assisted suicide is a problematic paradigm, and I'm going to highlight the things that Alex said and give you a little more enfleshment of what's really behind that. They know that all the drugs that they give cause nausea and vomiting because you're giving massive doses above what are legitimate doses of these medications. The unconsciousness ranges for, you know, from a short period of time to 32 minutes. And as Alex said, it's really not possible that 1 minute later that you're dead. I think, again, there's no real medical person there in many cases to really assess death. So somebody's calling unconsciousness death. You know, every night I go to sleep, I'm unconscious, and you know, I calling it death in 1 minute is absurd. But there are abject failures, and I'm going to give you one specific case. Is David Pruitt. He had lung cancer. It was in 2005. He was prescribed the usual death cocktail by the promoters of assisted suicide. His wife was neutral about him. You know, she thought the right thing to do, and this is important for all of you family members that might have other family members who want to consider this or think this is a good idea. Going along with somebody is really not valuing the person. You have to recognize, even if they believe this is a good paradigm, you should not go along with that. What you need to do is to push back gently and lovingly. You know, I had patients who've come to me and they say, Dr. Topp, you don't know what it's like to have this degree of heart failure. I can't walk across from my bed to the bathroom without short of breath. You don't know, I'm for assisted suicide. And you know, I let them talk as long as they can. And at some point I have to say, you know, I appreciate hearing what you say. You're right. I don't know what it's like. I thankfully don't have heart failure. And I appreciate you telling me, can I tell you how I feel about your life? And they basically will tell me, yeah, that's okay, because I've listened and now they're going to hopefully listen to me. I say, you know, I want you to know, if I'm your doctor, I will do my best to support your shortness of breath, to give you medications, morphine, which is one of God's gift to the dying. It relieves air hunger. That was true with my late wife, who had pulmonary metastases from her leiomyosarcoma. And so we have drugs to help you with symptoms, but I want you to know I would never participate in your assisted suicide. And this woman went, why? What difference does it make to you? And I said, well, you know, I like talking to you. And for the first time in our 2-day relationship, I'd never met her before, and she wasn't my regular patient. She puts her hand over on me and gets a little teary-eyed of just reflecting back her specialness, her humanity. That's how we respond to people. That's what good palliative care doctors do. That's what good hospice systems do. They do not become vending machines where you pull this lever because they say, I want to be dead. I might as well be dead. Don't help me. You push back, and it's impossible, I think, for humans not to respond to true love and true compassion. And the wife learned that because what happened, he took the overdose, David Pruitt did, and then some 60 hours later, he wakes up and he says, what the hell happened? I'm quoting, what the hell happened? I thought I was supposed to be dead. And he has an epiphany with this. They actually had a 2-page spread in the Oregonian talking about this case. And he talked about how God must not want him to die. And he wasn't a particularly religious person before that, but at least this epiphany. And his wife was elated because he lived for another 11, 12 days, and he died naturally. And by the way, I would say died naturally with dignity, as was my father's death, my late wife's death, my mother's death. All of them had difficulty and suffering, sometimes for months before they're dead, and my wife's case for years. But, you know, while there was suffering, there was also great joy, because your life is special when you know we all know we're going to die. That's like taxes. You can't get away from it. But when you know you have a terminal illness and your life is not maybe 10, 20 years off, you may only have years or months even, it changes everything about the way you relate. I often tell people, I think my wife and I only had one argument in the last 5 years of her life, because we both knew she was going to die. And that was a very different rate of arguments than we had before we had a lethal diagnosis in my late wife. I miss her very much. It's been 7 years, but I wouldn't trade a nanosecond of those last days with each other, even though a lot of times it was difficult. So Derek Humphrey is the enthusiastic promoter of this. He started this in England. He's a writer, British writer. He still lives in Oregon outside of Eugene. And he started this euthanasia research group organization. I think it's still extant. But in commenting on the David Pruitt case that I just described to you, he said, you know, this is a miserable path to death. You know, he was lingering, you know, it wasn't an efficient killing, essentially. And he also criticizes the same thing Alex and I just said. You know, the doctor's almost never there. I mean, at best, 15% of the time were they there, 85% of the time they're not. And he's saying we shouldn't have this overdose approach, even though that was his bill with his other promoters of assisted suicide. We ought to be able to give the lethal injection. Lingering deaths up to 2 days, you know, are not acceptable. And he actually shared a case in his book of a man who is still alive at 7 hours. And of course, watching this brutal death of overdoses, which are never pretty, his father then took a pillow and smothered him. That's the kind of thing people are pressured to do with this approach, this non-efficient killing method of overdoses, which is easier to sell to the public. But on the other hand, it's not what Canada recognized, that it's not a very efficient killing method. So the euphemisms I said are clearly driving that the individuals being perceived in control with assisted suicide, even though in Oregon, we've clearly had documented cases of somebody with Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, who couldn't swallow the pills. And by the way, the pills got sent from my institution, OHSU, to the coast, where this Patrick Matheny lived in a trailer in the backyard of his parents' home. And basically, so one of his relatives was with him, and he said he had to help him because he couldn't swallow the pills. Well, how do you help somebody who can't swallow the pills? I ask you. Well, we don't know, because he wouldn't tell, and there's no investigation whatsoever. And of course, the Oregon government said, well, you know, we have this problem with disabled people not being able to swallow. We could change the law. And essentially he's hinting at injection, because that's the only approach if you can't swallow. So you already have this dichotomy of care with people who are disabled not having access to it. And you can just imagine at some point that will be the argument on the other side. to push for euthanasia, as has happened now in Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, other countries. It's perceived as being passive, which is why the public swallows this. And a Hollywood image, you're going to take a little pill and you slip off into sleep painlessly. And of course, that's not true. And that's why this whole research effort is being led by a guy by the name of Lonnie Shavelson. Alex referred to him. He, I think, at one time lived in San Francisco, and that's where he set up a clinic as soon as it passed in California, where you could pay him a couple $1,000s and he'd off you using the deadly cocktail. But of course, all of the promoters of death, Lonnie Shavelson and others, basically have figured out this is costly. And part of the reason is that, well, let me go back. It's costly because the drug company bought the patent on the original death drug, which was Seconal, a rapid-acting barbiturate. It was only pennies a pill, but they had the corner in the market, so they raised the price of the pill, and it's now up to over $3,500, $3,600 for an overdose. And so here we have people like Lonnie Shavelson who are helping the dying by doing unethical research on them. And so why did Lonnie get into this thing? Well, even before it passed in California, like 20 years before, he wrote a book, and it was called A Chosen Death is the name of the book. He describes watching a Hemlock Society leader, that her name is Sarah, and she's helping a guy by the name of Gene who basically wanted assisted suicide, but he changed his mind in the course of it. So Sarah is trying to help Gene. He talks about being in Gene's home by invitation, and Sarah hands Gene a poisonous brew that she prepared, saying, "Okay, Toots, here you go." This lighthearted approach to it is just amazing to me as somebody who's dealt with lots of people who have illnesses that are terminal at the end of life over my 43 or 44 year career as a doctor. Gene drinks the poison, the liquid, and began to fall asleep. And Sarah lovingly puts a plastic bag over his head. This is part of Derek Humphrey's playbook of how do you do assisted suicide. But then suddenly, Gene, faced with the prospect of immediate death, he screamed, "I'm cold," and tried to rip the bag off his face. But he only had one good hand. And so when that good hand flew up to try to rip the bag off the face, Sarah catches Gene's hand and holds it. His body thrusts up there as he's trying to fight naturally to live, which is a natural instinct for all of us. She pulls his arm away and then lays across his chest with her body weight. He is then rocking and trying to fight against it. And she says lovingly, "Gene, go to the light, go to the light." And he pushed against her body and ultimately stops moving. This is the same guy that's doing the research right now. And he's being driven by, it was inefficient to kill people with overdoses. So Alex has mentioned there's really no tracking of this. There's no firsthand reports. It's all second and third hand reports, with the exception of a few doctors who attend the deaths. The active destructions of record is unprecedented, either before or after the decision to do this. Medical records are never destroyed. You got to keep them from a minimum of 7 years. In the case of pediatrics, 21 years. The lethal medications are not ingested in about a third of the cases. And who tracks that? What happens to these deadly cocktails in somebody's medicine cabinet, or as they say, on the bedside stand? And then the ulterior motives are not just theoretical. Just 10% of elders in the United States suffer elder abuse. And the ultimate elder abuse would be actively trying to end the person's life because of secondary gain. Is this theoretical? No. Tammy Sawyer is a real estate person here, and she was doing business with real estate, but also was named the trustee for Thomas Middleton. And see, he's an ALS patient. Again, that's Lou Gehrig's disease. And he instructed her to rent the home because the market was down and sell it when the market came back up. Instead, within 2 days of his death, she takes $90,000 out of his bank account, puts it in her own account, and then sells the house immediately, puts it on the market. And none of this would have come to light because there's no investigation of these assisted suicides whatsoever. It just happened to be that Tammy Sawyer was guilty of many other fraudulent activities. And sure enough, this came out. They never even bothered to prosecute this because she had so many other fraudulent activities in her life. But the reality is that there are people who are not with good intentions about others, especially when there's a seductive pile of money or property at stake. And you can imagine that there is fighting over estates without even thinking about assisted suicide in families. It's all too common that people do this. I personally has never asked a patient, who stands to gain if you should die? What life insurance policy do you have and who are the heirs? And try to figure out, gee, does this person who wants this person to go ahead and have assisted suicide, are they on the person's side, or are there some other alternative motive or gain? So there are healthcare pressures, and I want you to be aware that today I spend a lot of time advocating for my patient to get a CT or an MRI. I have to get pre-authorization for it. Maybe at one time there was a lot of medicine being done to people when we should have been thinking about what's the goal, what does the person really want for themselves? Do they want to be given things when really they're going to naturally die no matter what we do? The pressures are significant. So I'm going to tell you the story about Barbara Wagner, who is a school bus driver when she was alive here in Oregon. She had metastatic lung cancer. She had a couple years of remission. It recurred, and her oncologist wanted her to try a drug called Tarceva. Tarceva is a medicine that would not cure her cancer, but it would statistically give her about a 46% increased chance of being alive in 1 year. But the Oregon Health Plan sends her a letter that the chemotherapy is not covered, but assisted suicide under the rubric of pain relief under line 264 of the Oregon Health Plan, a list of priorities, it would be 100% covered. So it's necessary to point out from the Oregon Health Plan director that we consider assisted suicide as a, quote, comfort care measure. You can't make this up. I mean, the solution to suffering is to end the life of the sufferer. So I think that this will play, well, just a short clip of what Barbara Wagner had to say about that herself.
So Dr. Toffler,
Yeah.
you're showing a video and you're in share. On the left-hand side of the share, just below the video, you're going to see a button that allows you to share the sound. Otherwise, you can't share the sound.
Okay. So, all right. So left-hand side of the screen.
On the bottom. So when you have the share thing, you'll notice on the left-hand side on the bottom, it allows you to hit a little button that allows you to share the sound. If you don't hit that, we can't see the sound.
All right, thanks for that heads up. Let me see if I can get it. Otherwise, I'll have to give you the narrative myself, which is fine. Let me see if I can stop this for a second. Okay, so let's see. I got to get to your
screen. You see over here on the left-hand side that there's two little boxes. One allows you to maximize the view.
Yeah, the left-hand side.
On the bottom.
Yeah,
you can see it. There should be two little boxes there in your share because you've done share screen. Then you've got your video. And it allows you to do that. If not, you can just share with us the story because
yeah, I'm in interest of time. So basically, Barbara's saying, what right do they have to tell me this? And I'll just go ahead and do it. Basically, she's saying that the doctor wanted to help her. She wanted to take it, might give her a little bit extra life. And basically, the Oregon Health Plan writes her this letter, unable to approve the drug. And then basically, they will pay for the comfort care. They'll pay for assisted dying. And so she said, what right do they have to tell me I can help you die, but I won't pay for helping me live? So this is the head of the commission that sets the policy for Oregon Health Plan. We'll pay for you to live, to die, but not to live is cruel. And he responds, I don't think anybody's saying that. Nobody's saying that. That's an unfortunate interpretation. So I said it's a disturbing message. People deserve relief of their suffering, not giving an overdose to help them to die. They basically talked about there's a financial incentive to offer death. And indeed there is, because at that time, Tarceva was $4,000 and the overdose pills were $100. Now, as I said, that's gone up to $3,600 for the overdose drug. So it would still be cost effective to end the person's life, because the reality is that when you have cancer, we start talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes for chemotherapy drugs that cost 7,000 or 8,000. And then Saha, the director, says we have invested thousands of dollars in somebody living maybe weeks to months. That takes away people from people who are, say, young and pregnant, essentially is what they're saying. So it's kind of sad. Right now, I guess I would ask the question, are we having too much care or too little? Right now, we have a tremendous problem in the United States where we don't have a uniform healthcare access. We are working really hard, and there's a lot of public debate for years now on getting everybody access to care. So the reality is I have to fight for people's care now. It's not like we're giving them too much. Are people who are supposed care managers at the end of life, and I experienced this with my own family, are they really care managers or are they cost managers? They're really trying to get us out of a assisted living kind of facility or a long-term care facility for my dad who needed a lot of support with his advanced Parkinson's, and they're trying to move him out of one facility where he's getting good care to another one. So this whole question, I know people in medicine are seeing this, is increasingly they're talking about what are the goals of care, which is fine to ask somebody what they want. But on the other hand, it's getting at, gee, do you really want to have this thing done? It's it's being expensive, won't change things that much. Well, a lot of people do want to give it a try. And, maybe, if they have even a 10% chance of something good coming of an intervention, they want it. My dad was like that. He was a World War II veteran, fought in Korea, Vietnam. I know why we won World War II. He was the kind of guy, if there was a 2% chance of something working versus death, he would have taken it. So we're sometimes going with our wishes and looking at a societal problem as opposed to the individual problem. So we've got practical problems. I've talked about the nausea, vomiting. You have to give people these powerful antiemetic, anti-vomiting drugs, ondansetron, metoclopramide, and you have the lingering failed deaths. The cost of drugs I've talked about that went from $100 in 1998 to, or less than $100 even, to over $3,600. This has driven a lot of research on trying to get a more deadly cocktail that people don't vomit. And so we're now basically working on, the death movement is working on these things and trying to get it down where dying happens more quickly. But even with these new cocktails, you have a lot of deaths that linger and linger. So you give massive doses of the highest doses you can of the antiemetic drugs. Then they're giving, fast acting if you want to go the expensive route. And they're trying to do the less expensive route now with other drugs. The Seconal or secobarbital was relatively inexpensive. Now it's very expensive. So they've come up with these deadly mixtures that they're trying, just as Alex said, with different people. And it's not human, it's not animals beforehand, which most research does. You work with animals and then you apply it to humans. So they come up with these two different drug cocktails that I'm showing you here. One is DDMP1, which is a combination of digoxin, an anti-anxiety agent, diazepam, and morphine and propranolol. But look at the doses. We're talking about, normally, I would have to monitor a patient, giving him 1/4 milligram of digoxin and make sure, because that's such a deadly poison. So they're literally giving this like a half hour beforehand, 100 to 200 times the dose, because they now come up with the second generation DDMP. And that means you're now doubling the dose of digoxin, which by itself will kill you. And so then they give the anti-anxiety medication, the sleeping medication, and propranolol, which in a massive dose of 100 to 200 times the normal dose will stop your heart. This is what they're working with. And the reformulation, doubling the dose, is there in the bottom. And they're getting the time to going to sleep down to 8 minutes on average. But still, you've got 7.5 hours of lingering death. Again, if you're going to be ingenuous rather than disingenuous about this issue, euthanasia would be the right way to go if you believe that you can actively end somebody's life. And this is just a smokescreen to get it in the door. And ultimately, you'll move to euthanasia, as Derek Humphrey says. So this is from the Oregon Health Plan. It shows in the purple, the Seconal used to be the only thing being used. And now you see the experimentation in the last 6 or 7 years with other different types of drugs, including these DDMP version 1 and version 2. On the very right, you see in a blue line, DDMA, which basically is a drug that is now got amitriptyline substituted for propranolol. And amitriptyline is clearly lethal when you give it massive doses. I had an amitriptyline overdose when I was practicing in a small town before I went to the university 35 years ago. And basically, it is an awful way to die. And she was in the ICU with just that one drug for 2 or 3 days and swelled up like a balloon. And it was nip and tuck for 48 hours before she finally turned the corner. It was not pretty, not, quote, dignified, end quote. We still have the lingering deaths. The overdose isn't what was sold to the public. Oversight's missing, wide open door for abuse. We have dispassionate. I want to emphasize that again. It's dispassionate, not compassionate. The doctors talking about this are often biased. They're involved in it. They stand to gain money. It's really a sad paradigm where the experimentation is dangerous, it's unethical, and it's still a dangerous practice with no oversight, as was said by Alex many times. It's intertwined with financial incentives. The concept of 6 months to live is totally fabrication. I never had a crystal ball reading course in medical school or residency, and we're wrong a lot of times. In fact, there's a case I didn't share with you of one, Jeanette Hall, who came to a doctor who was not for assisted suicide, convinced her to give it a try with chemotherapy and radiation. Her cancer melted away, and it's now 20 years since that time where she was supposedly totally qualified, and she'd voted for assisted suicide. She believed in it, but she had a caring doctor, one of my compatriots who helped start Physicians for Compassionate Care, and here she is alive 20 years later. Important anecdotes to share. Often people say, well, these are dated anecdotes. They're from 20 years ago. Well, it's a shroud of secrecy over this whole thing. So the notion that I told a Spanish reporter was that you can't get information about these things, and it's only the things that leak out with either an honest reporter in the press who follows the story and publishes it, or it's a family that tells the story, but there's a shroud of secrecy. None of this is coming from the state. The horrible reality that depression screening is not done, that people are not treated. Another anecdote was someone who had recurrent depression all of his life, and he basically went to a death doctor, and unfortunately the death doctor didn't ask questions about depression. Fortunately, he came into our view, and we actually gave him help. He lived for 23 months before he died naturally of his metastatic cancer. That's the kind of so-called compassionate care from the other side. Doesn't even bother to find out about major depression. It's been a lifelong problem. There's no requirement for hospice or palliative care. A lot of times that happens. Unfortunately, in Oregon, the hospices have become corrupted. They initially weren't involved in this at all. Now they're involved with assisted suicide. And now you have to be careful. Who is your hospice? Which is the hospice you're going to? Who is your palliative care doctor? Because at my institution, OHSU, one of the palliative care doctors was the one who gave Brittany Menard her overdose and has gone around the country with this, even in states where it's not legal. So we've already talked about the absence of physicians, the no requirement to notify family. It adversely affects the refinement of systems in place to help give excellent care to the dying, both palliative care and hospice, and clearly undermines the essential doctor-patient trust. And many patients come to me is when somebody recommends this or that, are they one of the death doctors? Especially when they give a negative prognosis. And that's kind of sad that people can't trust their doctors. So I hope I've given you a little insight into what's going on in Oregon, and left a little time for questions. And Alex, I think, was good enough to say he'd monitor that and organize it. And I appreciate, again, the time to be with all of you.
Well, the one chat question we received was actually going to be, it was about the difference in palliative care issues, but that was one that Dr. David Smith can answer fine because that's his specialty. But we do have some questions here. And for instance, there was one question here about how can we protect ourselves and our family members from being forcibly euthanasia denied care during the pandemic. Now, this is a little bit of a different issue, but it does certainly come home during this pandemic time when there's issues about medical treatment and life-sustaining care, etc., related to this issue.
Well, the question's really apropos because, there already have been issues of we only have a limited number of respirators. Now, as it turns out, respirators are the last thing you want to use, and only if you have to, because it really has not enhanced the outcome of care. But the reality is that it is easy for people to give up on a person who's really very, very sick with multi-system organ problems, which happens with some cases of COVID, particularly the older people. I mean, in Oregon, we could prevent 77% of the deaths from COVID if we gave the vaccine to those 70 and older. And some states have followed that. Even I have to reluctantly praise Governor Newsom, where I'm not usually in favor of whatever he decides, but he at least allocated the vaccine to the highest risk group. But they're also the people who would be with, just like with Barbara Wagner, well, they don't have a long prognosis because they're older. So you see this bias, this mentality among care providers, and they are different. There's 1 million doctors in this country, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of physicians assistants, of nurse practitioners, and the like. And we all don't share the same philosophy, or what Physicians for Compassionate Care would say, the inherent value of all human life at all of its stages. And that's what we believe in. Well, not all of my colleagues do. And so when you wonder about what care you're receiving, it would be important to ask your provider, what is their philosophy? What is their stance about assisted suicide? Do they think it's appropriate under some circumstances? And if the answer is yes, I would try to find a different provider. If they gave me an opinion and they had that, even if they were taking care of me, first I'd try to get a different provider. But if the circumstances are that they're already in it and they're doing a good job, I'd say, well, I want a second opinion with any decisions that your recommendations you have. I want somebody like Dr. Stevens, my associate, who gave a positive reflection of Jeanette Hall's worth, and she's alive 20 years later. I think you want somebody like me who would say, their life is worthwhile, even though they have advanced kidney failure or they have advanced pulmonary lung problems. And this is true. I mean, one of my patients literally he was a curmudgeon. I loved him. He was basically, I'll say his first name's Lonnie, and he actually said I could share this, so it's not violating HIPAA. And he basically had never been admitted to the hospital with pneumonia, even though he is a chronic smoker. And this time he gets in the hospital with pneumonia. He's curmudgeon. He would kind of control the situation and get mad at people. And he just says to the fellows who are taking care of him in the ICU, let me go, just let me go. And indeed, they listened to him, and they just put him on flow oxygen, blow by oxygen, and they gave him big doses of morphine for comfort. And I get a call from the resident to come see my patient. I had no idea that he was on death's door. They're moving him to the ward because he doesn't want any advanced ICU care. And so I come there. Fortunately, I just come back from church and a walk. I have my sports coat on. I go to the hospital and I say, Lonnie is very, very soporific at this point. You can hardly wake him up. And I said, Lonnie, did you want to die? And I had to shake him and rub on his chest. And finally his eyes open and he realizes it's Dr. Toffler. And I get, just with nodding and head shaking this way or that way, in 3 minutes, I become convinced that he does not want to die now, even though he told people that just the night before, just hours before. And so I literally interrupt rounds. I go to the rounds. I basically say, he's changed his mind. He does want support. He's not even getting albuterol for his asthma. And I think we need to reconsider things. It caused a great kerfuffle. People wondering about, they've never given Narcan to somebody that had said they just let him go. And he wakes up and he's in pain now because of the Narcan. But within hours, they take care of him. And the attending wants me to come back when he's more awake to really see if this is what he wants. And sure enough, he nods his head. Yeah. In fact, within the next 24 hours, Dr. Toffler, you saved my life. Because I knew the patient. Now, this is the problem. With hospital care, often you have specialists who just work in the hospital. They have no history of the patient. They're doing what the patient asks, but they don't know the personality. And so you see the fragmentation. And by the way, I'm not blaming hospitalists. I'm not blaming subspecialists. There is a problem with primary care. I was one of only 2 doctors that would regularly make rounds on my patients when they got admitted to the hospital. So we also need to be proactive in being involved with our patients, even if we're not directly writing orders, with the doctors who are. And I would say to the palliative care specialists and all, be sure, if you're not already doing it, make sure that you actually try to get in contact with the primary care doctor who's not making rounds regularly, to get a sense of the family, the personality, because they're more likely, and I say more likely, not necessarily, because there's some doctors in the hospital who do a fantastic job of getting this background. But I'd say on average, no. And I say you got to be proactive on both ends, both primary care doctors like me, family physicians, internists, and also hospitalists, palliative care specialists. So we need to talk to each other. So how do you safeguard yourself? Make sure you know what the doctor's attitude is, or the care team's attitude is. If there's somebody who does assisted suicide, find another doctor.
So we have a question about the Oregon's Department of Corrections. If a prisoner requests assisted suicide, would they be able to then die by assisted suicide? That
has already happened, and you know, it's interesting that's brought up because I don't remember the details now, but he is facing a long time in prison, I think at the very least, and he wants assisted suicide, and I think at the time he was denied because the prognosis is not less than 6 months. Now, again, as Alex has said, this has gone away in many cases where you're now having these laws passed, not only in Canada, but in the United States, where, you know, you don't necessarily have to be so-called terminal. By the way, terminal now has been defined in Oregon as including diabetes mellitus. Now, I have a lot of diabetic patients, many of whom, because of their diabetes being controlled, have a prognosis that is no different than somebody who doesn't have diabetes. I mean, I have people with diabetes in their 80s. And so diabetes is not what I would consider a lethal illness. Can it lead to other conditions like cardiac or stroke or problems with vision? Of course it can. Kidney failure. But the reality, if you take your insulin or your oral medications, you watch your diet, you're active, your prognosis is really pretty darn good. And I have also people in their 20s who are active contractors who basically also have a long prognosis because they did such an excellent job of managing their diabetes. But that, in the Oregon Health Plan, we've gotten a written letter from a researcher in one of the northern states, I think it's in Sweden. Alex can correct me about that, but he wrote to the Oregon Health Plan and asked specifically and got a very straight answer in writing. Yes, diabetes would be considered a reason for being able to qualify for assisted suicide. And in fact, if you look at the reasons for death, both in Oregon and Washington, in terms of the underlying diagnosis, indeed, diabetes shows up at least a half dozen times, sometimes in the same year, quite a number of cases. That was the illness, diabetes mellitus.
So there is a question that keeps coming up about the issue of the use of drugs that might be abused in the case of palliative care. But Dr. David Smith, who's a palliative care specialist, will be dealing with that in his talk. There is another question, because some of these new assisted suicide laws, such as, and also in Canada, we have this problem, the issue of conscience rights are now coming up. For instance, in the New Mexico bill, it requires that a physician refer for the purpose of assisted suicide. So if a doctor doesn't want to do assisted suicide, they must refer. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, indeed. That, you know, I was once confused about this issue, and I thought that, you know, I was a doctor first, and I kind of parked my conscience and my faith by the door, and I was wrong. And so referral is really direct cooperation with a wrong. And nobody's holding a gun at my face and head. Unfortunately, as Alex said, when you when you disagree with a referral in some countries like Canada, it's now you could be persecuted, or there are people saying, if you don't want to do this, you don't want to provide full service with your patients, you should change professions, or you should go into a field that isolates you from assisted suicide, like pathology, or perhaps dermatology. I would say a dermatologist even isn't isolated from this, because you can have diseases of the skin that also are reflected with very serious internal organ diseases. And that is just not a non-starter as a supposed option. And so it's imposing, if you will, this is the argument against that. You're imposing your belief in this paradigm, in this sacrament of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I call it that deliberately, because they have a belief and a faith in this being a solution to suffering without any proof of that. You don't have any way to ask people after they're dead, was this a good solution, a good option for you? And so I would argue that this is imposing a belief system, immorality, if you will, I won't call it morality, on others. And that supposedly is a violation of their own paradigm of maximum strength for autonomy. even people like Derek Humphrey, when I've debated him a couple different times, at least has the intellectual honesty to say, no, you shouldn't be forced to do these things. That's not what he intended. But you see the passionate enthusiasts for this paradigm who literally are pushing for laws that would totally destroy the fabric of ethical medical practice. And I think there are giants in this field who I think underscore this very well. Daniel Somasi at the Georgetown Institute of Ethics. I think it's parts of it named after Pellegrino, who is, I think, one of the greatest ethicists of my lifetime. And I used to dialogue with him regularly. He's a wonderful man, and he died just several years ago. But I remember him asking me, well, can't you get a group of doctors there at OHSU who would resist this kind of thing? I said, I can count on one hand out of 1,200 physicians in OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University, that are willing to stand out publicly against this. And that's a sad commentary on our profession, and how much it's eroded from our previous Hippocratic tradition. And in fact, I just comment, we don't take the Hippocratic Oath. We take this modified Geneva Oath. And so I'm standing at graduation or white coat ceremony and basically are telling people that, I'm taking an oath with a person on my right who does abortions and a person on my left who does assisted suicide, or both. And we're taking the same oath. And you say, well, how can you do that? Well, the oath really says nothing. I'll try to do the best I can to protect the doctor-patient relationship. And I think all three of us are saying this sincerely, but we have absolutely no ethic that I will not give any deadly drug, even if asked, which protected patients for a couple millennia. And we have lost that. I think the last study of this was by Edmund Pellegrino, and there was one school in New York, I think in Buffalo, that actually was still using the original Hippocratic Oath in about 1997, over 20 years ago. And there are some schools, like in Australia, there was Notre Dame, not the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, but Notre Dame in Australia, that still takes the original Hippocratic Oath. So they still exist as recently as a couple of years ago when I was in Australia, but not in the United States as far as I know.
So I'm Dr. David Smith. I'm director of palliative care, or we call it supportive medicine at Baptist Health in Little Rock. And we are the largest private hospital in Arkansas. So I do see a lot of these cases, and I'm going to be covering some of that today. I was originally asked to talk about definitions, but a lot of those have been covered. Dr. Toffler has very well spoken about the euphemisms, so I'll hit some of these points briefly and try to move on. Maybe that'll give some more time for questions. So I'm going to have to get my slides where they will advance now. There we go. As a healthcare physician, I think it's very relevant to look at this study that was done back in 1990, which showed 39% of physicians had ordered drugs to hasten death. But shockingly, 16% of critical care nurses had engaged in assisted suicide or euthanasia. Now, these weren't all bad people, but I think a lot of it was the lack of ethical teaching, a lot of malformed or misinformed intentions. And so it is a prevalent problem. When I first heard I guess I'd heard the word euthanasia. I hadn't really spent much time thinking about that. But this book came out in 1974 when I was in my cardiology fellowship, which was my profession for 35 years in my other life. And this just caught me in disbelief. And I was so ill prepared to understand the content and give a reasoned response. This word euthanasia came out in the 17th century to mean an easy, painless, happy death. And again, we all agree that it's a job of a physician to help in relieving suffering, and there are many types of suffering. As Dr. Toffler said, we're a whole person, a whole patient. We need to know our patients, know all about their social history and their background and values. But to understand this, again, I think we need a lot more unpacking to understand the word, its implications and applications. So my goal today is going to, again, emphasize the common understanding of euthanasia is to intentionally end a life. But there's some other debatable subcategories. It's been mentioned about some of the ways we look at the world some of the ways we distort the way we talk. And then there are some common misunderstandings and misapplications of sedation and good palliative care. And since questions have come up, hopefully I'll be directing my remarks more toward that. So classically, when you talk about types of euthanasia, this is the model given. And I think it's just almost useless to most of us because we don't really think about this, but the active is the usual common understanding. There's voluntary, involuntary, assisted, indirect, and passive. So voluntary is when the autonomous individual volunteers for this and doesn't have any coercion. Non-voluntary is not by choice, and basically this is murder. Active euthanasia, we've been talking about, is when you intentionally kill yourself or it is done by someone with high-dose drugs. And of course, assisted suicide has been described a great deal. Now, I think some of the debatable, deceptive uses of the term euthanasia have to do with indirect euthanasia. Sometimes people attach the double effect doctrine to this. For example, if I'm treating a heart patient and they've come in with a heart attack and have this terrible, terrible pain, I give them a measured amount of morphine. And I've never killed anybody with my morphine when I was doing that, but I was always concerned about it. But I was going to give them enough to give them relief from their suffering. And so it would be said that if I did that without intention, that would be indirect euthanasia. Again, I don't like to use that term in this application. And of course, I'm sensitive as a palliative care doctor, talking about withholding and withdrawing. Unfortunately, I have to do that at times. And some would call this passive euthanasia. So again, I just don't like these terms because I think they confuse more than help in any way whatsoever. One of my favorite ethics teachers used this little box, and I think this really helps all of us. As a person enmeshed in the scientific method, I have an inclination to think that, well, if you give me the facts, we'll sit down and do reasoning and we'll come up with the same conclusions. Well, of course, we know that makes us laugh a bit. Loyalties also play a big role. I grew up as a very loyal Southerner, proud of my heritage, proud of the state of Arkansas, and proud of the legacy of my family, who was associated with the Civil War. And so I grew up for decades thinking the Confederate flag was somewhat like purple and gold in my hometown Ashdown Panther football team. But as I learned about the offensiveness to the African-American brothers and sisters, and because of my belief in an image of God in a theological or theocentric way, it brought me to have a course correction. So loyalties are very important. But then you see how worldview can trump a lot of our reasoning and loyalties. And so the theocentric or God-centered view finds its dignity in a different way than many others. The man-centered worldview is very materialistic and finds human dignity in just the subjective human experience of being a person. They say, well, that's me, mine, autonomy. This view also claims that moral absolutes exist in a relative way and have relative definitions. And here we have personal autonomy becoming the highest good, becomes more important than any other statement of dignity. So we have our ongoing culture clash. Now, to avoid the shock of this word euthanasia, I think this also explains why there's been so much emphasis on euphemisms, because they've sprung up to soften the impact of words that might imply intentional killing. And what's interesting is that these words are not only used so often, but they also reflect loyalties, worldview, values. And the words reflect some underlying agendas, as has been pointed out many times. Now, a classic example of a postmodern definition in the state of Arkansas, if you remember, one of our famous citizens says, when you're defining the word is, it depends on how you define the word is, or what you mean by the word is, depends on how you define it. So again, that's the kind of world we live in. And then Dr. Toffler has talked about the words, the euphemisms, right to die, and the changing meanings. And so we have these very fuzzy euphemisms, and we've redefined a lot of well understood concepts and ethical principles. Compassion, we all agree, is a great thing. But again, using compassion in choices. And again, the most frequently used term we hear these days is physician aid in dying. And I take a little offense to that because I have to do that every day. I'm going to give you a couple of cases now, and hopefully I will answer some questions as I show you some of these cases. Unfortunately, one of the things that we are faced in doing is a compassionate ventilator withdrawal. And this is a case where I heard this word double effect used and misused repeatedly. And so I think it's very important to have a clear understanding about that. Now, this case was an unfortunate 31-year-old young lady who had cerebral palsy and who had been in a institution, a development center, all of her life. She had had multiple health problems. She had bad lungs, and she had had a lot of problem with aspiration, and she was admitted again with another episode of aspiration pneumonia. This required a breathing machine or ventilator, and it was continued for about 6 days. Interestingly, and I think this is important to this case, she had not been on narcotics before. And finally, after 6 days, which is a little bit early for most people, a decision was made to stop the ventilator. What is amazing about this, and why this case is so important, is that medications, megadoses of narcotics and sedatives were given over 30 minutes to a patient who was not accustomed to them. And this patient died 41 minutes later after the dose of medicine was first given. And then if you notice at the end there, 6 minutes before the patient died, the nurse reported that the patient was no longer breathing, and additional narcotic and additional sedative were given. That's a usual amount that I give, total amount, before I take a patient off a ventilator. Now, this case, again, has really been brought to our attention because it was a case that wound up in federal court. So note the typical amount of medication given on the left column, and see the total. You don't have to worry about the drugs, but one, the top, Dilaudid is an opiate, Versed is a sedative. And note on the left side, the patient was given 6 to 17 times the usual amount of the opiate or Dilaudid, and 4 to 20 times as much Versed as we would normally give. It's also interesting that most of the patients that we give these to, if they're not super sick, a large number of them will die after an hour to 18 hours. And more than 30% of the patients leave the intensive care unit. That's especially true with young people who have amazingly strong hearts. So this case really grabbed some attention. And so the physician who did this had his privileges taken away after there were 7 cases that had been brought to light by the hospital personnel. And these cases, according to the hospital staff, exceeded the standard of care. Well, of course, most of us doctors don't like to be told that we don't do something according to the standard of care. And this was a great threat to him because he was going to lose his hospital privileges. So the hospital, rather than being accused and convicted of that they had done things unfairly to this doctor, went and got outside reviewers in another state, and they reviewed this. And these doctors were sued later on for compensation because he had lost so much money, because he had lost his hospital access, he had lost his privileges, and it had a tremendous impact on him. Well, the reviewers from Ohio, they couldn't be tried in state court here, so this went to federal court. It's interesting that one reviewer called his actions euthanasia. And even as an expert witness, I think all of us were sort of dancing around what was obvious. We'd never really had a case like this, and it's a very powerful statement to say, you know, a physician has participated in euthanasia. So the family physician defended himself by pointing out some generally true statements. In palliative medicine, there's no ceiling dose to the amount of medications needed for relief. And suffering patients at the end of life should be given the benefit of the doubt regarding the dosage of medicine to ensure no smothering. And terminal sedation or terminal extubation, patients should be given more latitude regarding the medicine, the amounts of medicine, according to the doctrine of double effect. Well, questions were raised in this case, and I think it's important for us to look at this. Was this euthanasia? Was this acceptable treatment by the doctrine of double effect? What is that doctrine, or what is that rule? What is the role of intent? Who can judge intent? Was this treatment, or was it killing? Now, the first and local palliative care doctor was an expert witness, but he gave a very weak deposition. And this, I think, became very clear to his attorneys. So the doctor's attorneys, the doctor who was bringing the suit, hired Dr. Timothy Quill. Now, he's a renowned palliative care doctor from the University of Rochester. He is the first author of a very long time used book, and I even carry a copy of that in my pocket for the last 9 years. Very good book. Well, Dr. Quill is no stranger to our friends in Canada because he is the king of euphemisms related to end of life, and well known, and Dr. Toffler already mentioned Dr. Ed Pellegrino, who described him as a very dangerous man because of his kind manners, his soothing voice, and his sinister underlying agenda. He is a board member of the Death with Dignity Center in Portland, Oregon. And he first came to national attention when in 1991, and I very firmly remember this case, he published, I guess, in the first major United States medical journal, at least that I'm aware of, a case of physician-assisted suicide, highly controversial even at that time. Well, Dr. Quill then partnered with physicians from New York and 3 physicians from Washington State, and they both went to their own state courts, and they pushed for the constitutionality of laws prohibiting, actually to basically to say that this was a exercise that was protected under the Constitution. And so, again, this was very controversial. It was, again, not accepted in those states, but it was kicked up to the Supreme Court. And this is where we have the famous landmark case. It's called Vacco versus Quill. And the statement, again, if you're a palliative care doctor, you appreciate this to a great degree. Everyone, regardless of physical condition, is entitled, if competent, to refuse life-sustaining medical treatment, but no one is permitted to assist a suicide. When a patient dies from an underlying fatal illness, he dies from the disease or pathology. But if a patient ingests lethal medication prescribed by a physician, he is killed by that medication. Now, the work of Dr. Quill has gone on, and he has tried to move forward physician-assisted suicide anywhere he can. And he has even been one of the key expert witnesses for the 2016 Canadian law, which allows physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. And even while he was giving this testimony, he had to reveal that he was lobbying for physician-assisted suicide legalization in Massachusetts. Now, when pressed, though, well, do you favor euthanasia? He, of course, danced around that question a bit. Again, under oath, he answered it this way. He says, active euthanasia is when the doctor actually delivers a lethal medication. And he says, which is not legal in the United States, but not necessarily unethical. He claims that this was not something that was done in that case. And so he talked about the terms that are used very actively in the care of patients, such as physicians aid in dying, physician-assisted death. And he commented that, well, if you're going to do physician-assisted suicide, if you're opposed to that practice, you call it physician-assisted suicide, and you would want to equate it with mental illness, and that goes along with words like suicide. So you don't think that should be an option for people, and that's why you use that kind of language. And the reason I use physician and aid in dying is really more comprehensive and really shows what we're doing for our patients. Now, Quill says that this case was not euthanasia that you see in the Netherlands, because there it's quite different, because the Europeans would give 10 to 20 times as much medication and lethal doses. And in addition, they would give a drug like potassium chloride to stop the heart. Well, he hadn't really looked at the case very carefully. It was very obvious when he was giving his testimony. He didn't do a great job, but even still, you can see in the case that I presented, the doctor was using that much medicine. He also made a very amazing statement that ventilator withdrawals are palliative emergencies. He said the dose of medicine given to the patient was appropriate, but later under cross-examination, when my attorney pulled out my little book that I had loaned to him, and also as he was looking at the guidelines at the University of Arkansas, he had to back up and begin to say, yes, he had even helped put those guidelines together, and yes, those were accurate, and that yes, patients should receive the lowest dose of medication necessary to control the symptoms. But he said, those are just guidelines, and doctors don't follow those. And it was very disappointing hear someone from our profession making those kinds of statements. Now, the first expert, as well as Dr. Quill, defended the doctor who was trying to bring the case against the reviewers. They defended themselves based on the rule or the doctrine of double effect. And I know that Father Tyler will be much more adept at discussing this, but again, Thomas Aquinas apparently defended self-defense according to this doctrine. Killing the attacking enemy is justified, he argues, based on the fact that one does not intend to kill them. And political scientists speak of just war theory based on this. So I'm sure you probably have heard this someplace along the line. But there are many formulations, and they're very important to us who practice medicine. There are many different formulations, some longer, some shorter. But this one sort of gets added, and I think it's worthwhile to look at. The action being evaluated must be inherently good, or at least morally neutral. The good effect must be obtained by means of the effect. The good effect must not be obtained by means of a bad effect. The bad effect must not be intended, only permitted. There must not be other means to obtain the good effect. And lastly, there must be a proportionally grave reason for permitting the bad effect. Now, academics are sort of lumpers and splitters, and here's a version that some of us simpler people like me. It's a lumper. And it says that the effect you're willing or you intend only good effects with what you do. And also, this is something that is so often forgotten, is the proportionality principle. You use a dose that only fits the symptoms only being treated, and also the relevant contextual features. So in the case that I presented, a significant question that you could raise is, using 5 to 20 times the usual amount, was this proportionate and was this appropriate? The real controversy, and much of this comes to this disagreement about how much sedation is appropriate. And the point to make is it should be proportionate and appropriate for the situation, not too much. In reality, palliative sedation is a term reserved for a different situation and not for taking people off a ventilator. In this trial and the use of many others, physicians have confused this matter. We have very little teaching about double effect. I don't think I was ever taught about this before I got into this work. And so proportionate means the use of sedatives to reduce the signs and symptoms of pain and distress, to suppress consciousness only insofar as necessary to relieve the distressing symptoms. And the doctor in my case, or this case, as well as Dr. Quill, well, I should say the doctor who was defending himself, as well as Dr. Quill who was defending him, tried to justify the use of sedatives that they were intentionally suppressing consciousness without limit. Well, let's look at this, because the question's been raised about how do we distinguish much of this terminology. There are appropriate double effect sedation. There is therapeutic, and the word that Dr. Solmesi, that Dr. Toffler mentioned his name, he uses parsimonious or stingy. Direct sedation, then sedation to unconsciousness and death. Double effect sedation is actually ordinary sedation. And here the intention is to treat a symptom. Sedation is not unexpected, but you're not trying, that's not what you want necessarily, but you will tolerate sedation. So Macy, as I mentioned, speaks of this word parsimonious direct sedation. To paraphrase an ancient philosopher, Paracelsus, medicines are poison, therapy is a matter of dose. Intent to sedate, but you only give enough to relieve suffering. You intend to sedate, but only enough to relieve suffering. You do not intend unconsciousness and death. Now, even Quill would call for a need for proportionate palliative sedation. So, as Dr. Toffler pointed out, this is an extremely small group of patients where to give this stingy direct sedation, where you have no other choice, you have no other options left. This comes along for a palliative care doctor where we have 822 beds, and I guess that represents maybe 15,000 patients over the last decade, where we are treating the sickest of the sick in the state of Arkansas. They get funneled in here. We don't have quite as many cancer patients as does the Cancer Institute at the university. And I finally had one, and I'm going to tell you about that one that happened around Christmas time. And my friend at the university who heads the section there, I think has had maybe two, and they have far more frequent severe pain cases than we do. So the case is truly one that egregiously demonstrated sedation to unconsciousness and death. And here the means were neither good nor neutral, and therefore they violated the proportionality requirement of the rule of double effect, and this is not morally acceptable. So now I am going to show you one of those rare cases where the symptoms of delirium and pain were so bad that when I treated both symptoms with, I had to treat both symptoms with megadoses of medications. And I basically kept the patient asleep with the side effects for 18 days. That was not my intention, but it was ethically acceptable. Now, I'm not going to get you, again, don't get hung up too much on the medical part here, but we had a 51-year-old man who had been very healthy, who had severe cancer of his head and neck, and then it was so bad it went to his skin, and Dr. Stern described it as one of the worst cases he's ever had, because he basically, if he goes to your skin, you die in a short period of time, but he was able to keep this fellow alive for several years. But then in September of 2020, he began having rather intractable pain, and he said, I've just got to have pain relief. I don't want to go into any more treatments. So he called for hospice. And after a month, though, he was having increasing amounts of pain and had to be on a patient control infusion, where he would touch the control and he would get a bolus of Dilaudid, the narcotic. That worked for a period of time. But then 2 months later, he began having one of the worst types of things we see, and that's agitated delirium. And he was up and down all night long. He couldn't sleep. And one of his greatest wishes was to stay at home and die at home. And it looked like maybe even with IV medication, he could do that. And so they did that for a couple of weeks, but it just got worse and worse. And he was up on, as you can see down at the bottom, he was on huge doses of sedation and narcotics, when finally I got the call and they said, we've got to put him in the inpatient. We've got to try something else because this is not working. So he was put in the hospital and he was started on this anesthesia agent called ketamine. Now, you might say, well, look, you put him to sleep, didn't you? Well, actually, we use it in such a low dose that we get the analgesic effect instead of the sedative effect, which was not our wish. And frankly, I'd never used that drug before. I'd read about it, I'd studied about it, but I'd never used it before. And so our university colleagues, VA colleagues, they gave us input. We had pharmacy colleagues, we had anesthesiology colleagues, we had multiple teams looking at this, trying to give just enough medication. And then we were finding out that our Dilaudid was working against us, so we had to go to another big gun called methadone, and then gradually decrease our other narcotic. And by January 9th, we were on the largest methadone dose I've ever heard of, but he was still flailing his arms intermittently. And so we stopped the hydromorphone, which we thought, or the Dilaudid, which we thought was giving us a problem, and started the drug fentanyl. And again, we had to continue those until he died. Now, again, if you look at all of this, you might say, well, Dr. Smith, you know, you just have semantics because you just sedated him to death. Well, he didn't quit breathing, and we gradually increased all of it. He had incredible amount of opiate and benzo tolerance. So that's why he could absorb all of that, because that would have killed any of the rest of us. So there are some people who would claim, well, you're just fooling yourself, that what you're talking about, proportionate palliative sedation, is actually terminal sedation, or it's just another euphemism you're throwing around for euthanasia. But there is a difference. With palliative sedation, you're getting just enough to relieve suffering. And if you can keep them lightly sedated, as Dr. Toffler said, sometimes you can wake them up, give them a little rest, say, how are you doing? Do you want to go back to sleep? Or, are you better now? Sometimes they said, well, I'm better. And so you don't have to sedate anymore. But then on the other hand, there are those who say, well, this patient's just going to get terminal sedation. And that's basically when you start with the plan to cause and to keep the patient unconscious until death. So sedation to unconsciousness and death is not a desirable thing, because it's amazing when my patients go home or when they start narcotics or when they start these medications, there are a certain number of people who don't want to do it, or there will be families who will point out, well, we want to keep talking to our loved one. We want to tell them, I love you. Thank you. I forgive you. Will you forgive me? You know, there's not a lot of conversation, but they want to be able to do that if they possibly can. And so sedation and unconsciousness also violates the third condition of the double effect. You don't do evil that good may result. That's another biblical verse. And then it violates the basic goals of medicine. You restore patient health and use as little medicine as possible. And otherwise, it does become poison. Now, you say restore health? Well, that's kind of strange. Well, that's why I call ourselves supportive medicine. We want to restore health. And so we're not people that look at ourselves as comfort doctors. I think in a legitimate way, that's a way we look at ourselves. We're supportive doctors. And so health is a relative thing. And even at the end of life, it may be just to get rid of the nausea and vomiting, or to help someone sleep, or to help relieve constipation or relieve pain. That's what we're trying to do, is give them the best health that they can enjoy for the rest of their life. So my conclusions are this: good palliative care may use some of the same tools as what are used in euthanasia, but it's not euthanasia. Euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are moral equivalents with different names, but intention counts. Therapeutic sedation is clinically beneficial and ethical. Intention counts. Inappropriate sedation to death is a form of euthanasia. Palliative medicine, with the goal of restoration health, uses appropriate pain control and sedation. And withdrawing from patients whose health cannot be restored is done appropriately only when the burdens are greater than the benefit.
And our next presentation is by Father Jason Tyler, and I'll let him introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Alex. Yes, I'm Father Jason Tyler. I'm the pastor of St. Joseph Catholic Church in Fayetteville. I also serve as bioethicist for the Diocese of Little Rock, and that means that in part I serve as an advisor to the bishop on issues of bioethics, ethics in medicine, etc., and at times as a resource, say to our Catholic hospitals, and basically just take an interest in these topics. And I'm glad to be able to present here today and talk about spirituality, in particular Christian spirituality, in the dying process, and how we can look at dying, although it's something bad of itself. Death and pain, suffering, death were never part of God's original plan. Nonetheless, God can bring good out of difficult situations. And so as we oppose euthanasia and as we oppose physician-assisted suicide, it's important also to be able to look at the good that we are trying to preserve, the good that we are trying to maintain, and that is some of the good that can be found in the dying process. As Dr. Smith alluded to, some of the times when families reconcile, when people have those moments to say goodbye, to care for one another along the way. Now, of course, I am a Catholic priest, and so my point of view is going to reflect that. But I hope also that my presentation speaks to Christians of all types, as I'll have a couple of Catholic references, but also just several scriptural references along the way as well. And of course, I can't touch on every possible aspect of the spirituality involved here, because it is such a complex thing, and the experience is not going to be identical really for any two people. But I do want to again speak on the idea as a whole, and especially to look at some of the good that can happen in the dying process, and what we want to be able to keep and in some of the many reasons that we would oppose euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. So as we look at this, it's worth reflecting on first this idea: what is death? From that spiritual perspective, we say it's the separation of the soul from the body. It's the end of our time on earth. In many ways, we see it as also, though, as going home. As St. Paul says to the Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform the body of our lowly condition into conformity with his glorious body by the exertion of the power he has given, the power that he has even to subject all things to himself. And then in Romans 5:8, yet we are courageous. We would rather leave the body and go home to the Lord. We say life is changed, not ended. And that's a line from part of the Catholic funeral liturgy that I'll quote from again later. But that's an important perspective for us to remember as well, that again, as we look toward our true home in heaven, leaving this earth ultimately means a change of life, not the total end of life. But then if that's death, what about dying itself? Because ultimately, that's a big part of what we're talking about, right? That euthanasia short circuits the dying process. It tries to completely go around that, to take that away, to make it, in their terms, more dignified. But in reality, we've seen already some of the, very clear ways that that's not good language and doesn't even work within the terms that the other side would say necessarily. Many people speak about being more afraid of dying than of death itself. And of course, we can probably relate to that, right? Dying, we can see in many people as painful. It makes a person feel helpless, dependent on others. The dying process is mysterious. There's a lot of unknown involved there. We recognize that as we are dying, we are ultimately without control of what's going on. And we've got to remember, the time in which we are living is a time in which we can so often eliminate pain, which is good, right? To eliminate pain. We can feel independent. We can know whatever we want to know. And we can control so much around that is around us. And so the dying process in that way is so radically different than those other parts of life that, again, in 21st century first world, that we've been able to sort of count on, that we can feel like we're in control, that we can know what we want, that we can be without pain whenever we want. And again, as we look at all these things, and it's we know we have this idea that death is painful, etc. We heard both from Alex and from Dr. Toffler this idea that the fear of pain, even more than pain itself, is a huge driver in the whole debate around euthanasia and among those who would advocate for it. So again, as we look at this, what about dying? Remember that if we can embrace the dying process, if we can accept it as something that is going to be part of life, then to embrace it becomes another way that we can be countercultural. And our faith calls us in so many ways to be countercultural, right? So if we're guided by our faith, we can say that we don't have to be in control of every moment, because God is ultimately in control. And we can be okay with not having that control at the end. We don't have to know exactly when we will die. That's one of the other things that can drive something like euthanasia for someone who is in the dying process, is to have that control and that knowledge about when death might happen. And it's okay, we have to realize, to be dependent at the end of life. We were, in fact, created by God to live among others and not simply to be separate islands. Sorry about that. Separate islands from one another. And again, we're created within society, created among others. And so to be dependent on someone else, as we are at a time of illness, at a time of difficulty, to be dependent is a very human quality, ultimately. As we hear in Romans 6, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. We seek to face the reality of death with the confidence of faith. Now, that does not mean it will be easy. It simply means that we know that God will guide us through it. Again, not that it will be easy, but that we will have our guide, that God is there for us. And that's what I tell people whenever I'm called to visit someone to give the anointing of the sick that we do within Catholic practice, is that I explain a big part of it is simply recognizing the presence of God. That anointing is about that assurance that Jesus is with you in your suffering and in that difficult time. We were indeed buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might live in newness of life. And as we think about dying, as we think about the pain that's involved, the suffering that is there, and it's very real. And again, we don't seek suffering for itself, but when it comes, we recognize that even as bad as it is, God can bring something good from it. And so in that way, suffering can have value for us spiritually. Again, not that we seek it, but that we accept it. Suffering means an opportunity to unite that suffering to the suffering of Jesus. Certainly we believe in Jesus risen from the dead, but also to get to that resurrection, he died first, and then there was a lot of suffering that was involved there. And so our suffering, we can unite to Jesus along the way. When we are suffering, if we are in that dying process, that's an opportunity also to pray for ourselves, to pray for our family and our friends, to pray for the world as a whole, that we see in that time the way that again, being united to Jesus, being able to connect our suffering to him, gives us maybe a depth of prayer that we wouldn't be able to recognize otherwise. It's also important to note the time God gives us on earth is never useless. It can always be turned to something good. And again, why, what are some of the big arguments about shortening someone's life? Again, pain is a big part of it. The fear of pain is huge there. But there's this implicit thing that happens as well, where we're sort of saying, okay, gosh, maybe I want to end my life because I feel so useless. I can't produce anything. I can't, engage in, say, the athletic activities I used to engage in, or whatever the case may be. We should never let the dying person feel useless. And if we get to that point, we should never feel useless. Because whatever experience we have on earth is always something that can be turned to good. There's always something that we can offer to God and seek to glorify him with it. And so that's one of the areas really to push back also on this, the whole euthanasia mentality, is that again, part of it is this idea of being completely free from pain at all costs. But another part of it is, and really the more dangerous part is the suggestion of someone's life having no value, of someone reaching a point of where we're saying this is a life not worth living. And that's, again, something to be especially concerned about there. Ultimately, we remember that we are stewards, not owners of our lives. Our life belongs to God. And with our life, again, we can glorify God. That it's him whom we seek, and it's God that we look to please in all things. And we never seek death in this way either, because to seek death would be to seek to take from God what is ultimately his, to take the life that he has given us and to throw it away. And so, so we never seek death, but we can accept death when it comes. We can ultimately go along in that sense with it and embrace when it comes, even without, again, actively provoking it, so to speak. And that goes to some of the distinctions that Dr. Smith was making earlier as well, that we don't want to and give a certain medicine that has the exact purpose of death, but sometimes a medicine may shorten our lives if that's not the intention, if it's the only way to control the pain that's involved. And that's where we get into some of the double effect and such as well. But the key that it all comes down to there too, we don't own our lives just to dispose of it as we will. We are stewards. We're the ones that have been entrusted with this life to care for it, to use it to glorify God, but not to throw around willy-nilly. For if we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And with this, again, similar to what I said before, our earthly life is always a good in and of itself, even though it's not the supreme good. This balance allows us to forgo certain extraordinary means or sometimes disproportionate means, they're called, of treatment at the end of life. But it keeps us from considering euthanasia, which would be an action or omission, which of itself or by intention causes death, in order that all suffering may in this way be eliminated. And that's just a Vatican document there from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith from 1980 even. As we think about, again, the question of extraordinary means or proportionate means of treatment, these questions of when is the right time to stop aggressive treatment, to simply allow death in. You'll hear the language a lot of benefits versus burdens, and that's accurate as long as we remember that the life of the person, whether our own life or another person's life, is never a burden. The life is never a burden. The life of the person is always a good thing. The question is rather, is a proposed treatment beneficial or burdensome? And to what degree? Is it more beneficial or more burdensome? Keeping in mind, again, always, that the life itself is to be considered a good, is to be considered something to be cherished, to be nurtured, and to be used for the glory of God along the way. I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. So why don't we like to talk about death? Here's something to consider, that death is going to happen to all of us, right? We can't avoid it. But yet, it seems so taboo. It's something that we don't like to talk about. We don't like to, say, even talk to relatives who are going to have to make those end-of-life decisions for us. We often are afraid to talk to them about what we want, about how much we would value our lives, say, and how that life would be precious, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of all the difficulties that the dying process can bring. We should also be ready to talk about death and be ready to have those conversations when things are going well, so that it's not the same kind of rush and the same sort of pressure at the end, but to be able to speak about death with loved ones, especially, is a way too that we can be ready and able to embrace some of the dying process when it comes. Because again, to have a society without euthanasia would be to have a society that is ready to accept the dying process in a very mature way, so to speak, a way that can say that yes, it's bad, but also something that that we can find real value and real good in it, even in the midst of all the trials and the difficulties, the troubles that come along the way. In that sense, too, that's where I said euthanasia is often trying to circumvent the dying process, trying to get around the pain, the suffering, the helplessness, the dependency, whatever else that comes in there. So in that sense, we recognize, all of the real harm that comes about with euthanasia. It takes a life, and that's where we start from, right? In terms of seeing why it's wrong, why we fight against it, why we want to keep it out of places like Arkansas and want to reverse it in places, say like Oregon or California, where it's already a reality. Euthanasia is wrong because it's a direct attack on life itself. And that's, again, that's our starting point. It's a direct attack. It's going after a life, whether it's one's own or another's. And so for that, that's our first starting point for where it's wrong. But then also we look at the other areas that have the fallout, if you will, from that wrong act. Euthanasia robs family and friends of the chance to care for the dying person. Again, a lot of people might think, well, gosh, I don't want to do that. That's a tough task. But there's a lot of love that's expressed in that time. A lot of love back and forth. I can think of stories of relatives talking about taking turns staying with a dying relative to make sure that the person would never be alone at the end. And those chances that we have too to be there at the end, but again, not just the end itself, throughout that process, to exercise the compassion, to exercise the kind of love, and the love that we exercise, that we practice in that moment, carries over into other areas of our lives. When we care for someone who has a problem, so to speak, their illness, that they have a problem we cannot fix, and we simply exercise the love of being there, that makes us into a more loving, more compassionate kind of people in all the various areas of our lives. And so it should help us beyond just that moment in that hospital room or that hospice room or that room at the home, beyond wherever that spot is. It forms us more and more to be the kind of people who are loving and caring and compassionate because of being with the person, not just giving them the injection or the pill or whatever that ends it, but to be with them with their suffering. Euthanasia increases the idea of seeing the person as simply useful rather than being a good in and of himself or herself. And I mentioned that a bit earlier too, that the euthanasia mentality is really fueled by an idea of human usefulness, almost human doings rather than human beings. And we have to approach instead the idea of every human person is a good in and of himself or herself, a good to be sought and protected. If euthanasia becomes widely practiced, does our society become less compassionate? It's the question I throw out here for reflection. And that's just going back to what I said earlier. Those skills that we have in truly caring for a person, caring even when we cannot cure, spill over into other areas and hopefully move us to be able to help the hungry, the homeless, the sick in other areas, everyone who needs our support in some way or another. Our growth in compassion and in caring for the dying person should aid us there as well. Medicine is called to care even when it cannot cure, and that's a big part of what happens with palliative care, is to be able to care even when it cannot completely cure. And that's where euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide eliminate that reality. They eliminate that chance of being able to make medicine cure along the way. And with the growth of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, we have the real risk of medicine becoming more functional. Sort of the vending machine approach, I think Dr. Toffler said. And so what we want instead is medicine that is, yes, is very smart scientifically and functions well, but also focuses on true care and not being just a vending machine approach. You know, we want ultimately doctors who are scientists, yes, but also artists, that they practice the art of medicine. And if we're focused only on cure and never on care, then we lose some of that art of the medicine along the way. So this is a question really for reflection here for all of us. What is the best way to die? What is the best way to die? 21st century Americans probably would say asleep and unknowing, you know, that top one. It's painless. There's no time of that helplessness, no time of that dependency. It just sort of happens, right? While we're asleep and we just sort of never know it's coming as we don't have the pain and it's just over. Or is it better to die awake and alert? In the Middle Ages, that was definitely seen as the better way to die. To die in your sleep was seen as you know, something of a curse almost. But instead, to be awake and alert would be to allow one to say goodbye, to prepare spiritually, and to consciously embrace the suffering and unite that suffering to that of Jesus. Like I said earlier, that you know, to be aware of what's happening was seen as a somewhat better way to go. And, you know, all of us, even in opposing euthanasia, we may kind of still favor that asleep and unknowing way of dying because, again, of that question around the pain, the suffering that goes with it. But at the same time, again, it's worth reflecting, is it really always better, or would it be better, again, to have that foreknowledge, you know, that death is near, and to be able then to say goodbye, to be able to prepare spiritually, etc. And in conclusion here, I just have a quote from, again, this is from the Catholic funeral liturgy. In him, in Jesus, the hope of blessed resurrection has dawned, that those saddened by the certainty of dying might be consoled by the promise of immortality to come. Indeed, for your faithful Lord, life is changed, not ended. And when this earthly dwelling turns to dust, an eternal dwelling is made ready for them in heaven. All right, thank you very much. Glad to be able to speak to you now, and I'll look forward to being around for the questions in a little bit, and look forward now to hearing from Father Joseph Chan, who will take some of his own personal experience to reflect on.
I'm Father Joseph Chan. I'm the chaplain at Mercy Hospital in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I'm a physician. I practiced for almost 20 years, and I did also a fellowship in hospice and palliative care. Aspirations of becoming a priest is a total surrender. And after being in practice for 20 years, one of the prayers that I was able to take into my mind is the Suscipe, or the prayer of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, which is a prayer of total surrender. It says, take, O Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. Whatsoever I have a hold, I give it back to you. Simply give me your love, and that will be enough. And I will ask for nothing more. Last March, the weather forecast showers and possibly thunderstorms high in the 60s, was breezy with wind gusts and a chance of 100% precipitation. During this time, I came from a funeral from Little Rock, and went home to Fort Smith to drop my books, had dinner with my friends. And that morning, after loading my car, I thought at 10 a.m. that the rain, fog, and wind finally settled down. I thought that the storm was over, but I was wrong. Then I had this crash. You can see in the picture of the car, I was driving an Acura, that it is the whole body, of course, ruined. And you can also tell my possible injuries just from looking at it. My near-death experience tells us in anguish, I cried out, "Oh God." They told me that I was able to give telephone numbers, but I really cannot recall giving the phone numbers of my vocation director or my friend of mine, or even know how to unlock my phone. But in the turbulence, I can know, and I still can recall that I recalled God. And it reminded me later on of Psalm 107. I cried to the Lord in my distress. From my straits, he rescued me. The police report, when I look at it in May, 2 months later, it said that I hit a signpost and my car veered to the right guardrail on Interstate 44. It blew off 8 posts and the car sprinted. It rolled, flipped, and came to a final rest after it flipped. And 2 of my friends went to the accident scene, and this is what they saw. You can see that it is crossing, that's the water tower of Rolla, Missouri, up there. And the 8 posts that it blew off. And to my surprise, even the Department of Missouri of Transportation billed me to have this repaired. Of course, my insurance took care of it, thanks be to God. And further on, when I look at the insurance companies' pictures, they sent me the pictures of the car and the last one. With that totaled car, I was in coma for 2 weeks total. But right after the event, I could not recall anything. It seems like the impact made me unconscious right away after, if I gave the phone number or the code to my phone, which really never occurred to me. I did these several procedures. I underwent almost 20 procedures and surgeries. In that period of 2 weeks coma, a lot of things are happening. And I was a catastrophic case, meaning in case management, my bills racked up more than $1 million throughout my hospitalization. It's from March 10 to July. So I suffered an abdominal hemorrhage. I had exploratory laparotomy. I have a class 1 pelvic fracture. My liver was bleeding. My spleen ruptured, so they have to remove that. They called the vascular surgeons to embolize my hepatic arteries, but did not help, so they left me open for a day. I had fractured my pelvis, bleeding, and then to fixate me, they put me on a fixator, of course, which is a metal, so that I will not be able to move around and put my pelvis intact. Multiple ribs were fractured, so my lungs were punctured. I had pneumohemothorax, contusions, and the right side had air leaks, so they have to put another chest tube. So I had 3 chest tubes. My right leg was fractured. I had a rod. My left wrist was fractured. I had a screw and a plate. And I have thoracic fracture of my vertebrae on thoracic 5th and thoracic 4. Thanks be to God that I did not have a spinal cord injury, but it's so close to have a spinal cord injury. Then I had blood clots on both legs, so they have to put a filter. And that filter, after, because it's a foreign body, it had to be removed. And the only way it can be removed is to the internal carotid approach. And in the procedure, they nicked my internal carotid artery, which could have happened in that procedure. But it's good that there was disclosure. The vascular surgeon was very, very empathetic. And I had to have a PEG tube placement because I could not, of course, take anything by mouth. With all these events, I had post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is manifested whereby during the rep, because it was raining, I noticed that I could not clean up in a closed room. So with the sound of the rain, I got frightened about it. And I had traumatic brain injury from all the trauma, the noises, and the banging of my head. And subsequently, I became deaf. And on my left side, I have tinnitus. And on my right, I'm overtly oversensitive, especially to high-pitched noises. So I could not bear that and would cause me headaches and vomiting. My eye was also involved. I had peripheral field involvement. And with that, I could have blind spots, so driving can be a challenge, especially in the evening. With my therapies, since my left wrist is immobilized, I used my right upper extremity so often that I had a frozen shoulder. Then my intestines obstructed because of adhesions, and subsequently had Bell's palsy and vitaminosis D. You know, all those things in medicine, for us, it's probably extraordinary, because when I looked at my medical records and the testimonies of my friends and their diaries, it is, for me, when I look at it, I think this patient is already dead. My blood pressure went up to like 60s. The systolic blood pressure, my heart rate was in 160. I was breathing 60 per minute on a ventilator and fighting it out. So I would believe and humbly can admit that it is still a miracle that I'm still alive. Because though miracles will say, you know, for it to happen, you don't have to do anything extraordinary. But I think what's ordinary and extraordinary became flat for me. And I've been humbled that my friends told me that you're still a miracle, that you're alive. In those 2 weeks that I had coma, I was able to have a lot of dreams. I saw hell and I saw heaven. Hell was so cold, although it was very slick, very, very, very slick, and it is so smooth in hell, but it was eerie, it was scary to be there. And what I really treasured was the vision of heaven. It is like a cloud, like you're driving to something that is just so peaceful that I asked God to take me back. Because I knew, and then I realized that my pain will be horrible from all my surgeries and fixations, all my screws and plates. And true enough, when I saw this in my dream, the clouds were pierced by the right hand of God. And I always believe that that's the right hand of God. And that is why the first statement that I uttered when I was beginning to regain consciousness around April was that God came to me. And later on, as I'm undergoing some rehab, I was very humbled, but also saddened. But at the same time, I have slowly learned now, after 8 years, of what the meaning of what had happened was. But first, I have to look introspectively and see myself. And as a physician, it is kind of humbling to know that as a provider, I now needed some providers for myself. So meaning my gesture of having others care for me now becomes a form of charity for them. So even in my deathbed, I allowed people to care for me as a form of ministry to them. But foremost, I have to know who I am now, because after the accident, I felt like I vanished and was never the same again. My near death experience was a cause of traumatic brain injury and post traumatic stress disorder. When I went to Creighton for spirituality and directed retreats, I took a course of trauma. And I took it because I feel and think that I really need it. So, traumatic stressor is defined as any event that may cause or threaten death, serious injury, or sexual violence an individual, a close family, or a close friend. The exposure can be direct, witnessing in person or indirectly by learning that a close relative or close relative was exposed to trauma, or experiencing repeated or extreme indirect exposure to aversive details of the event, usually in the course of professional duties as with first responders. So right now, there's a lot of trauma going on with deaths from ventilators. We have trauma from blast injuries, from war, from gunshot wounds, from violence. The traumatic injury that I have, or TBI, first we have to define that your brain function, my brain function was altered. And because of that, my coma also had persisted for more than an hour. I had amnesia for more than a day, and that's why I was classified to have moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. And with all these changes in my brain, I really became another person in some ways, or a lot of ways. I had fatigue, attention deficit, learning and memory problems, impaired planning, problem solving, concrete thinking. I lacked initiative, inflexibility, dissociations, impulsivity, sudden affective fluctuations from flatness to irritability, outbursts of temper, and crying spells, communication problems, and lack of insight and self awareness. I look at myself as an infant in an old man's body, being totally dependent, and I would cry and laugh just like a baby, that my sister would often scold me why I'm laughing so much. PTSD is a very common diagnosis when I was working at the Veterans Affairs among Vietnam War veterans for what would happen with them. But it became my own personal diagnosis, and that is a very humbling phenomenon. It is an anxiety disorder experienced when an event is outside the range of usual human experience, such as a serious threat to one's life or physical integrity, or that of another person. In total, my NDE suddenly and most deeply convinced me that I am not and never was in control of my existence, the events of the world, my faith, vulnerability, and the reality of my death. And it takes me back to my prayer. Take, O Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. The same prayer that I said when I entered the seminary and upon ordination, and now even every day, because with my disabilities, there's always a mountain up front when I wake up in the morning. But as a whole, if a miracle happened, and when you are in total surrender to God, then what happens is you set aside and let God work. And that is actually what happened. But I have to have intercessors because the prayers of people, the churches, a lot of people in the diocese, in the country, and of course spread over. My siblings are in Australia and in France. They've been praying for me, and of course they're my saint, my patron saint, Saint Joseph, the rosaries that were there, people supporting me from the healthcare system, my friends in palliative care and hospice. They knew, and I knew it too because I received a box full of cards when I woke up that with my visual impairment, I would ask my sister to read it for me. But foremost, there is another intercessor. My friends, Dr. De Miranda and his wife, were in St. Louis during the crash. They were not there for me specifically, but they were for a ball game. But for a known reason, they heard about my accident. So one time they always want to go to St. Joseph's Shrine in downtown St. Louis. And in that shrine is housed the relic of St. Peter Claver, a Jesuit who is a missionary to Colombia, who took care of Black people from their illnesses and healed them. And his relic, which was not supposed to leave the premises of the shrine, was permitted to be carried to the hospital because they said there is a seminarian that is near death and we need to ask St. Peter Claver to intercede for him. You know, I was in coma and I didn't realize that a lot were moving behind me. People who are loving, caring, prayerful. And so I was able to move and move forward, knowing that I probably have lived for a purpose. I lost like 40 or almost 50 pounds from the accident. And this is the picture when I was in rehab. You can just see how tight I was holding the rod or the post. There is a standby wheelchair at the back in case I fall. All these things, I prescribed this to my patients with injuries, especially in the VA, but it all became mine. And before I left St. Louis, I made sure that I go back to the shrine. And in that time, my pelvic fixator has already been removed. It's probably 2 days after it was removed. And then I was able to hold the relic. Subsequently, I decided, because of my traumatic brain injury, I need to resume classes. So I had online class 6 months after the accident in September. And in January, I was able to go to the seminary. And in 2015, I was ordained as a deacon. Here, prostate at St. Boniface Church here in Fort Smith, I have to practice doing this prostration so that I can handle it and at the same time be able to genuflect and stand up again. There's Bishop Anthony Taylor, our bishop, who ordained me. And then the following year, in 2016, I was ordained at Christ the King Catholic Church in Little Rock. 2 years later, I made it a vow that I need to go to the shrine, and I offered a Thanksgiving Mass at the shrine of St. Joseph. You know, it reminded me of the 10 lepers who were cured. And hopefully I'm the one who went back just to thank God. And it just gave me a lot of peace to be able to make it. Because one desire that I pray is for me to be able to say Mass. And God made it possible. And to raise him in the Eucharist, to consecrate the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, is beyond all. So in 2014, we're reflecting from everything. I wrote a poem in Alter Christus. Alter Christum is just not another Christ, but in virtue of ordination, we priests stand, behave, body and soul as Christ here on earth to spread the news. And I did this poem with the image of myself and Jesus talking to each other while introspectively I look over what has happened to me in 2013. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just read it. And with all that happened, I started asking Jesus, where were you when I needed you most? The sky thundered, the rain flooded, and the wind shrieked. Stricken I could not see, pounded I could not hear, broken, paralyzed, anguished, drowned with tears. Afflicted, I screamed for help, terrified, my heart shattered for affection. Breathless, I sighed for your love. Confused, my soul vanished to oblivion. Darkness covered the earth, stillness, the wrath of gloom, silence, the deafness of death. Then life faded into mist. Clouds soared over the horizon, his right hand pierced through, extended to my being, and God came to me. Why your unbelief? No, this is Jesus saying, before you were born, I have called you by name. You were mine. I have fixed your trunk to make you forthright, your pelvis to make you steadfast, sewn you up so the bleeding ceased, save you to make you whole. Void, you will discover me anew. Deaf, obey me with your heart. Fractured, you are still to endure. Stunned, exclaim the good news. Have you empathized with me? Have my wounds become yours? Has a centurion stabbed your chest? Has my cross weighed down your shoulder? I called you and you resigned. My will and your will were molded, mortified by such a tragic cross. My protected embrace caused my own demise. I spared you for redemption, for with me nothing is impossible. Never let go of my outstretched hand. It is time when I needed you most. And truly, Jesus is needing me most during this time when we have a lot of things going on in our country and in our church. And it takes me back that to totally surrender is to leave nothing behind of ourselves, to be totally selfless. Take, O Lord, my liberty, my understanding, my memory, and my entire will. Whatever I have and hold is yours. Give me and I give it back. Give me only your love, and it'll be sufficient for me. And I close with my ordination card, and at the back of this is Pope St. John Paul II motto, which is totus tuos, is to give everything back to God. And the artist of this is Brother Ephraim from St. Meinrad Seminary. And I told him to portray myself as Jesus, the one who stabbed by the centurion, who has multiple wounds. And I've dedicated this to my mother. And with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Chan. If you want to share have any questions, you can put that in the chat right now, and we'd be happy to address them. I'm assuming that we have all of our speakers with us still. And I'll go to the view to make sure. But just please put your questions into the chat area. We actually do have all our speakers with us still, so there's not a problem with any questions being answered for you. This is an interesting question, and I don't know who wants to answer it, but the question is, should an individual have the legal right to decide the fate of their own life? I'm just going to look at this question because when we're talking about assisted suicide or euthanasia, the question doesn't quite fit philosophically because you're not actually deciding the fate of your own life. You're asking a physician or a nurse practitioner or whoever else to be directly involved with causing your death. And as much as suicide is not ever a good option in any way, shape, or form, this is a little bit different from that. So anyway, and so if one of the priests want to, I think actually Father Jason did talk about the question of our life being our own, etc. But nonetheless, the question doesn't quite fit with assisted suicide per se, because someone else is directly involved. See, the point of the whole issue that we're talking about here, which you obviously gathered by the end of this conference, is that no one here is opposed to a natural death. We're opposed to somebody being involved with killing another, right? And so in the case of medical treatment, nobody is opposed to the question of providing effective care for pain and symptoms, so long as that is done in such a way that there's no intention to cause death. But when the intention is to cause death, that would be something different. And in the same case here, palliative care decreases requests for euthanasia, but palliative care is not something. Here, I got to open this up. But we need it in Batesville as well as communities need it. Yeah. So palliative care is certainly necessary and very important, and it's very effective, and actually this is something Dr. Smith can talk to. But does it actually decrease requests for euthanasia? I would say it does. The problem I'm having is that's what's happened in Canada and what's happening in Oregon that Dr. Toffler referred to. And that was the point, that in Oregon, palliative care and assisted suicide are being melded in together. And the same thing's happening in Canada, where euthanasia is being pushed in with palliative care. So much so that on February 24th, the Delta Hospice Society, which is a hospice in Delta, British Columbia, is going to lose all of its funding because it refuses to kill. Nonetheless, I think this is a question that Dr. Smith should deal with, and that's the question of palliative care and its importance and why and in fact, it should be in every community. If I go to participants, I believe Dr. Smith is still with us. Yes, he is, and we can just unmute him.
Okay. Well, it is very true that even in the state of Arkansas, we are underserved as far as numbers of palliative care. You do not have to be a palliative care specialist to deliver good palliative care. And there are many physicians who are very, I sort of alluded to one who called himself one, but he hadn't had any training. I say the boards are not like rocket science in palliative care. A person can get the basics, and every physician should have some palliative care skills. So it's not, there are some cases, and I gave you the one, and that's once every 9 years. I mean, these are the impossible cases that people talk about all the time. But as I said before, those are so rare, even for me. I can remember 2 cases where, I just sweated bullets trying to get the controlled, calling for second opinions and getting the ethics committee to be sure we were doing everything. But the whole principles of being able to give, appropriate amounts of medications, give just enough, rarely is it something where there are really such specialized skills. So giving attention to detail, learning some basic, that is one thing that we keep trying. We have a palliative care commission in Arkansas. The governor asked us to study that, to try to improve that. And we've got a long way to go. But there are many very good hospices. I think the fact of the right to die, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we have a right to die. We have a right to live. And the Supreme Court has ruled, as I pointed out, that physicians, that's not our goal, our responsibility, our charge, and that it is condemned by the Supreme Court. So I don't know how to answer that question better than that. Yes, we're underserved in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of people that do it and do it well.
There is a question here, and I'm going to ask Dr. Toffler to answer it. So I will make sure that his Dr. Toffler, right, Bill Toffler, I'm going to ask him to unmute. And now we're going to go back to the question. What do you say to patients who don't affiliate with any faith and may be an atheist? How do you help convince them that euthanasia is not the answer?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I have a lot of patients who don't have any faith. Oregon is not one of the most church states in the country, for heaven's sakes. And they come to me because they actually trust me because I don't have an inherent conflict of interest. So it isn't a religious theme that you want a doctor that doesn't have a conflict of interest. It's a secular issue. I don't want a doctor that has a conflict of interest. And, you know, I'm getting older. I have to go to doctors. And so the reality is that we won't kill you. I mean, that's the point. It's like, I'm not making this up. I mean, I thought about putting a sign up that, you know, that we care, not killing, like the UK right to life group on end of life issues. That's a beautiful phrase. I think I saw it in one of your slides up front, Alex. Care, not killing. Think about this. How marvelous that phrase is. I want to do, you know, what Dr. Smith does. I want a Dr. Smith when I'm really in suffering at the end of life. I don't want somebody who at some point says, this is hard, you know, and it's costing a lot of money. Have you thought about, you know, just letting go? And I want somebody who would encourage me. And I'm not making this up. My dad, the one I said, you know, was a World War II veteran in Korea, Vietnam. He basically would be in the ICU with his advanced Parkinson's because of a medical error, and they're trying to get on top of the medical error in the ICU. And the nurse turns to my wife in front of my dad. I mean, he's soporific. He's asleep, but you don't know what people hear in their sleep. And she says, why don't you just let him go? Well, I want a nurse that wants to, you know, encourage. My dad wanted to live. There's no question. I have no doubt about it. I said he was opposite of my mother, who said, why doesn't God take me, over and over again, you know? And so people have different attitudes. And why would this nurse project her attitude on you know, it's just, it's unthinkable that we do that. But unfortunately, you know, we are human, and doctors get tired, nurses get tired, families get tired. So you want a doctor, whether you're religious or not, and I think that's exactly why people sometimes without faith. Now, if they have the belief system that a utilitarian, I do my best to share my belief system that their life is worthwhile, even when they don't value it. But I don't do that just with the dying. I do that with everyone. I mean, I take care of depressed patients who have suicidal ideations. And why would I treat that person with suicidal ideations who's not terminal in terms of imminently dying any different than the person who is imminently dying? And that's why doctors have to be consistent. That's why I say that Dean, I think he's still living, he's probably in his late 80s now, was so wise in saying, you know, even if society believes this, doctors can't be a part of that. Somebody else needs to do it. In fact, you know, Dr. Smith and I had no training whatsoever in how do we efficiently kill people. And sadly, in Oregon, just a few years ago, for the first time in our residency, family medicine residency, they were teaching doctors how to do it. And I had never seen that before. And you know, I was actually originally invited to that session, and the residents disinvited me because they just wanted to know how to do it. And for 3 hours, people who were involved in it, including the doctor who gave the overdose to Brittany Menard, were in that session talking about how to go about it. And I think that's a sad commentary. What part of medicine are they not getting taught in order to teach them how to kill? I mean, this is just a sad commentary. And so I think secular people deserve the same good care and a consistent doctor as people who have deeply held religious beliefs that life is sacred, and indeed it is.
I would also like to comment that Not Dead Yet, the disability rights group, it comes from a completely secular point of view, and they talk about this as a human rights issue. So for someone who's not from a faith background, this is something that they can totally talk about because it is a human rights issue. The issue of assisted suicide does undermine people at a very vulnerable time of their life. Now, this question's been asked before, but I'm going to ask it again, and it's for either Dr. Smith or Dr. Toffler or both. I could give the answer to it, but I'll let you guys answer it. With a person who has terminal diagnosis and is experiencing intractable pain continually, when morphine is used for pain, how is the balance found in dosage for effective pain management and depression of vital function, specifically with morphine use? So Dr. Smith,
yeah, you know, I tried to proactively talk about that with double effect. So and this idea of parsimonious, you know, there are certain canons of therapy that Dr. Solmese talks about. You know, we give just enough, the parsimony. We give proportionate amounts. We give with discretion. Our goal is to restore life rather than kill life. So we start out with that mindset, and we watch this person. You know, again, we have to educate sometimes. Sometimes we'll have a patient who may be a little delirious and they'll grunt a time or two, and the family says, oh, you need to give them more. And we do not, you know, we try to really measure. We don't try, you know, again, part of our modus operandi is we go into our patients, even when we take them off a ventilator, and say, you know, our goal, we don't know how long your loved one's going to live. We're going to give you just enough to keep them comfortable. This may take minutes, it may take hours, it may take days. Rarely do we have somebody go home. But I establish trust because, you know, you're talking about a very small number of people in the state of Arkansas. I don't know about Oregon because we haven't been educated to think that way. But we repeatedly try to tell them something so they'll trust us. And we say, we'll give just enough. We're never going to intentionally kill your loved one, but we'll be there. It may take days, may take weeks, but that's what we're going to do. And we know they're going to shut down if we're, you know, we don't stick tubes in them if they're, you know, we do keep their mouth moist. We keep them comfortable. But that's trust here. And I think that's fundamentally what the Hippocratic Oath, what the American Medical Association, internal medicine. So you take all the different oaths that we have written, it is about restoring health. It's not about killing people.
So Dr. Smith, I think,
let me add to what Dr. Smith said, because he brought up this idea of ventilators and morphine and all. One of my colleagues, again, he's now deceased, but he was a pulmonologist, and they actually did a study here in Oregon. It was his last publication. They kind of rushed it to publication before he died. But they looked at giving morphine to people after you took them off a ventilator. And when you gave morphine to patients who had been on ventilators, or as you tried to wean them off so that they were no longer on this, now what is considered disproportionate care by the family and the doctor and all, and the patient, they actually lived longer, giving judicious, parsimonious, as Dr. Smith's saying, that's a good word, of medication. So it didn't kill them. It actually extended their comfortable life, their time with their family, until they died naturally. So, you know, what Dr. Smith said is so important. If you have a doctor doing what he's doing, you will not end people's lives with morphine. It's not an impossible concept, of course, but the point is that generally the person's life is extended based on research that's published.
So I have two things to say. First of all, we need more doctors like Dr. Smith. Secondly, I think the reason the question keeps being posed is the fact that there are physicians today who have been trained in a different sort of ethic, who are actually intentionally overdosing patients with the intention of causing their death and then calling it double effect. So I get phone calls myself from people who are all upset about what happened to their mother, their father, and some of these cases they were it was because the physician was using high doses because they were in pain. Other cases it was because the physician actually did abuse the situation, and the difficulty is how would you ever prove that? It's very difficult. So because there's been a change in ethic for some people, for some physicians and how they've been trained, this question comes up because obviously it's being abused at times, and that is a problem. But then Dr. Smith is absolutely correct. It's about trust. So what's happening is the physician who doesn't have the who's lacking the proper ethic, what's happening is they're actually removing the trust from the physician who is acting in the right ethic, in the ethic of always caring for their patient. And so you're having this difficulty occur. And I think that this is a serious problem because as ethics change, then of course the concept of killing somebody gets lost. You should never kill someone, but that concept gets lost because someone would say, well, in certain circumstances, death is better than life, is what they're arguing. There's another question here about powers of attorney. Now, I'm assuming that the Arkansas Right to Life has what you'd call a will to live document or a power of attorney for healthcare document. Certainly, the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition sells an advance directive or a power of attorney document for healthcare to protect your life, but I'm assuming your group does also. So I would assume that to get so, and the question is actually, should you have an advance directive? And I would say, yes, you should have an advance directive, but you need one that protects your life, not one that might cause your death or might be misinterpreted to cause your death. So that's what's important with that. Yes, you should have a document saying these things, but these documents should be clear. The other thing is, I'm not sure exactly what Arkansas's law is. Maybe I should unmute Rose. She'd be right here, because I'm not sure exactly what Arkansas law, how it works. I can tell you how it works in most places. So I've unmuted Rose if she wants to say comment about it. But I would say that the best kind of advanced directive is one that allows you to appoint someone to make medical decisions for you when you can't make decisions for yourself. But then you should only appoint someone who you trust shares your values. And I say this all the time, don't appoint your oldest daughter just because she's your oldest daughter. If your oldest daughter doesn't share your values, don't have that person making medical decisions for you at your when you can't make decisions for yourself. Rose, do you have a comment on this power of attorney issue?
Yes, I do. And we just have a few more minutes left. So if you don't mind, Alex, we're going to stop questions and I'm going to close this out here in just a few minutes. Yes, Arkansas Right to Life does have the Will to Live form. You can download it from our website, artl.org, and ours is free. You don't have to pay for it. So there you go. So it gives you all the information that you need. If you would like to consult an attorney on filling it out, please do. You know, it's so important that we do have these conversations with our family and our loved ones to let them know what our wishes are and to find out what their wishes are, because it's too late when, you know, a catastrophic event like what happened to Dr. Chan, you know, happens. And his story was just really so powerful because, you know, thank God that he got the medical care that he did, and he's alive today to tell the story. But so many times those tragic things happen, and, you know, they unfortunately sometimes don't treat the patient because the injuries are too severe. So anyway, I just want to thank all of our speakers today. There were excellent presentations, and I know there was a lot of questions we didn't get to. Maybe we can find a way to address those when we give you the recorded session later in a few days. But each registrant will get that, and we invite you to share it with your family and your friends and get this conversation started. I know that there was a lot of information, so you may want to rewatch, if you stuck with us till the very end, these different presentations so that you can maybe think more deeply about what you heard and what you learned. I wanted to invite you, you know, we offered to send you materials. We offered to share with you Alex's video, Fatal Flaws, which is excellent. It tells the story of what's happening in Belgium and the Netherlands. And you can get this and other materials. He's got this little card that says, you know, do not kill me, that you can carry in your wallet, and it's got your name and address. There's my alarm telling me that, you know, it's time to stop. But I'm going to just say quickly, we would love to have you join Arkansas Right to Life if you haven't already. I want to again thank our sponsors, the Diocese of Little Rock Respect Life Office, Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and Family Council. The March for Life is coming up on March 14th. You know, join us in Little Rock for that. And again, if you're not a member of Arkansas Right to Life, we would love for you to join us. Our issues are abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. We don't hear a lot about euthanasia or infanticide really, but, you know, always about abortion. But these issues, like Alex was telling you, you know, 27 states and 25 in 2019. So it's timely topic that we need to just learn more. Thank you all. And I'm going to close it out. So have a nice evening. And thank you again for joining us, everybody.
Thank you very much.